Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Mushoku Tensei light novel readings. We are on volume 15, which means we're right in the meat of season 3, or what will potentially be season 3 of the anime. Couple of quick things. I want to go ahead and just say that I have read volume 14 of Slime. It's sitting over here. Let me grab it real quick. I have read volume 14, just completely finished it today, and I have to tell you right now, this is the biggest amount of bullshit I've ever read. What kind of a fucking cliffhanger is this? This is the meanest goddamn cliffhanger I have ever read, and the next volume doesn't come out until November 22nd. Fuck! So, I did do a bad. I went ahead and checked on the web novel, and I'm currently in the middle of reading the web novel for it, because you can't end a cliffhanger like that. There's no way I was not going to try and find out. That's just mean. Just fucking mean. Okay, so, on to the light novels that are coming down the pipeline that you guys might be interested in. For those of you who are reading Arifureta, like I am, volume 12 is out, and in just a few days, volume 13 drops. So if you're getting it, get it now. If you pre-ordered it, yay. I'm getting it on digital, so it costs a little bit less. But yeah, Arifureta comes out on the 2nd of August. Toby, where are you? There you are. All right, hang on a second, guys. I'm going to put this book away, and then we're going to feed the Toby. Right, Toby? Come here. Come here. Come here. There you go. Good boy. Okay. Mushoku Tensei Volume 19. Ooh, that needs to move as well. God, everything's coming out in November, man. November. Okay. So Volume 19 of Mushoku Tensei is coming out November 8th. I don't know if we're going to be caught up by that point. I think we'll be close, but we won't be quite there yet. But Volume 19 will drop November 8th, so keep that on your calendars. Like, we have 4 freaking series that are dropping in November. 2 of them on the same day. Slime Volume 15, November 22nd. Spider Volume 15. So if you're a reader of Soma Spider So What, that's also dropping on the 22nd. And then on November 29th, we're getting Sword Volume 11. Still, I have not checked, but at the moment, what I have here is Realist Hero Volume 17 is still not available because it hasn't, I think it hadn't been written yet. So, we'll see. That having been said, guys, my roommate is out of town right now. So, I am in the process of doing a major deep clean of everything. So I did a major deep clean of his room and got all his linens and vacuumed and everything and cleaned Toby's little sleep area, all that stuff. Cleaned the curtains. So the curtains here, the curtains in the living room, replaced a few curtains. This, you can't really see it, but so over here, I have like a big, thick comforter, and that's what I'm usually, when you guys see, I'm like, that's what I was spitting at. Well, that thing is wiped completely clean, and it was not an easy task, but I got it done, and I'm going to just try and, like a good girl, I'm going to swallow from now on. When instead of spitting it out, I'm just going to swallow like a good girl's supposed to. Don't take that to heart, guys. I know that's demeaning, but I'm just being silly. Don't go running to HR. I don't mean anything by it. A robot vacuum cleaner. I love vacuuming, so that's not a problem here. I've still got a whole bunch of vacuuming to still do, but vacuum most of the house, and I'm going through round 2, round 3 very, very soon. Okay, so yeah, lots going on, but we're on chapter 9, trying to go through 13 chapters. I think there's a special chapter afterwards. But here's the thing, guys. I'm supposed to be joining up with I'm supposed to be on the Zeros to Heroes podcast, or I was invited, and that starts at 8 p.m. So by 7, if I'm not close to finish, we're just going to call it. All right? Because I want to have time to, like, take him out again. Even though I just took him out, all he did was walk around and pee. But I know he's eaten, so by the time we go out in a few more hours, I know he's going to need to poo. So that is how it is. Also, guys, things have changed, of course, and that is, if you want to redeem exercises, you are free to do that. 120 is the max that we're accepting, but I do all my exercises now at the end of the show. So for those of you checking out this stream live, or if you're on YouTube, for those of you on YouTube, hello, come check me out live. It's a lot of fun. Saturdays at 4 p.m. Central Time, if you can make it.
Congratulations on graduating from Dave.
Thank you very much,
so
Trash.
Basically just getting a participation
Con for the sub. Thank you for the tier 1. Appreciate it. Can we get some nyantas in the chat? All right. Now that I've got all of that going on, I think it's time we just dive right into it. Let's just get started reading. I'm going to turn my hat backwards like a Mash Ketchum or something. All right. Let's get going. Chapter 9, Berserker Sword King versus Dragon God. That's right, we're in the thick of it now. Just finished Light Novel 12 reading. Very good. Oh, thank you! I appreciate it. Thank you. All right, here we go. So, here's the thing. We're on Chapter 9 of Volume 15. If you don't want this spoiler, now's a good time to move. But if you are cool with hanging around, welcome. Gotta catch them all. Gotcha. Several days before these events, 2 women had appeared at the gates of the magic city of Sharia. One was a gray-haired beastfolk with impressive muscles. The other was a human with a magnificent mane of crimson hair. The beastfolk woman was a head taller than her companion, but the 2 of them wore identical coats, and they both carried swords at their waist. Eris Greyrat and Ghislaine de Doldia had finally reached their destination after a lengthy journey from the Sword Sanctum. The trip had not been an easy one, to say the least. Eris had been in such a great hurry to see Rudius again that she'd chosen a shortcut through a forest where they'd quickly gotten lost, ultimately blundering into a nest of monsters which took some time to slay. And when they finally made it out of the forest and reached the nearest town, a group of local thugs unwisely provoked Eris, leading to a major scuffle, which made them a host of enemies, which led to another major scuffle, which led to problems at the border, which they solved with violence once again. It was largely Eris's own fault, in all honesty, but they'd ended up taking quite some time to reach Sharia. Yeah, this is past the manga and past the anime, so watch out there. Alrighty, moving on. Still, both Ghislaine and Eris had spent some time as adventurers. In the course of their journey, let's see. Okay, in the course of their journey, they'd eventually gotten back into the swing of things, and after entering the kingdom of Renoa, their progress to the city had been relatively smooth. Once in Sharia itself, their actions were also quite efficient. It helped that plenty of people at the local Adventurers Guild knew exactly where Rudius Greyrat's residence was. From the sound of things, everyone in this town knew Rudius's name. One helpful local even explained that they could pick out his house by looking for an unusually scaly creature from Beggaret in the yard, or for its companion, a peculiar-looking tree ant supposedly cultivated on the Demon Continent. In fact, the place did prove easy to find. Rudius's residence couldn't hold a candle to the massive mansion Eris had lived in as a child, of course, but it was large enough that it could easily have passed for some sort of inn. The yard was also spacious and looked like it could serve nicely as a training ground. While she discussed her impressions with Ghislaine for a while, Eris, rather uncharacteristically, was hesitant to step through the gate itself. Instead, she stood directly in front of it with her arms folded. For a time, everything was quiet. Ghislaine said nothing and neither did Eris. Her chin high in the air, she simply stared up at the building before her. From all appearances, she was convinced that Rudius would somehow sense her presence and emerge from within at any moment. The thoughts running through her mind concerned the many rumors she'd heard regarding Rudius in the course of their journey. Rudius Quagmire Greyrat was said to have slain a stray dragon and defeated a demon king. As the most powerful mage in the Renoa University of Magic, he inspired much fear and awe. But despite his arrogance and audacity, he was a friend to the weak, and there were many comical stories about his odd behavior. In other words, he was a relatively popular figure. Those who'd seen him at work struggled to describe the extent of his powers. Hearing their praise always made Eris smile, almost as if they were complimenting her. But among the many rumors she'd heard so far, it was some of the comical anecdotes that had really stuck with her. For example, the guy's crazy about his wife. You always see them shopping together on their way back from the university. Or, I saw him grab his wife's butt in the market. She flipped out on him. Or, he married this woman who looks like a kid, I swear. Or, he has 2 wives already, and who knows how many he'll end up with. Not much of a pious guy, that's for sure. They were rumors involving his wives, in other words. Every time she recalled these stories, Eris frowned deeply. Soon after crossing the border into Renoa, she'd learned their names, Sylphiette Greyrat and Roxy M. Greyrat. Eris couldn't figure out what she was supposed to say when she actually met them. She'd learned of them from Rudius's letter, heard rumors about them on her journey, and spent plenty of time thinking about them. But at the end of the day, she just didn't know how to get the results she wanted. And so, she stood like a statue in front of the gate. Fortunately, the stalemate was eventually broken by a thoughtful young maid. The moment Eris appeared at the gate, Aisha had asked herself, "Is that Eris? It must be, right?" and set out preparing things. She wanted to be ready to show Eris perfect hospitality the moment she knocked at the door. After nearly an hour of waiting, however, she finally decided to take the initiative herself. Aisha felt that she owed a great debt to Eris personally. While she didn't respect her quite as deeply as her brother, it was a fact that she had played a major part in saving Aisha from her captivity in Chiron. Lilia had always taught Aisha to repay her debts twofold. So when she'd heard about the possibility that Rudius might take Eris as his third wife, she'd silently decided to help make it happen, assuming Eris actually loved her brother, of course. Thanks to the little maid's helping hand, Eris finally managed to enter the house itself. Once inside, she was warmly welcomed by both Aisha and Lilia. While Aisha ran off to the university to get Sylphie and Roxy, Lilia filled her in on the current situation in more detail. Eris's introduction to Lucy came as something of a surprise to her, but while her smile was a little awkward, she found that her feelings weren't particularly negative. She could always have a baby of her own, after all, and hers might be a boy. Given how uncertain she'd been at first, this was a surprisingly self-assured attitude. Aisha and Lilia's friendly greeting had gone a long way towards soothing her nerves. Even when Sylphie, Roxy, and Norn arrived, the conversation stayed calm and peaceful. Rudius's 2 wives were perhaps a bit unsettled at the sight of Eris's more shapely body, but they were far from hostile toward her. It helped, of course, that Aisha and Lilia had already set the tone on their own initiative. But more importantly, Sylphie and Roxy had already talked the issue through on their own over the course of several private conversations. Unsurprisingly, Norn's expression suggested she was less than overjoyed at the situation, but since the matter had essentially been settled, she didn't offer any open opposition. She knew Sylphie, Roxy, and Rudius were all willing to accept Eris, and she was trying to be considerate of that fact. On top of that, it was obvious within minutes that Eris was passionately in love with Rudius, and also respected him deeply. It was a little embarrassing just to listen to her, and everyone likes hearing someone they're fond of complimented profusely. The peaceful mood didn't last for long, however. Eris finally got around to asking where Rudius was at the moment, and things took a turn for the turbulent. When she heard he'd gone off to fight Orsted, Eris snapped angrily at his wives. As far as she was concerned, it was their responsibility to accompany him into battle. "Why'd you let him go alone? Are you trying to get him killed?" We tried to go with him, but he told us to stay behind. He said we'd just get in the way, Sylphie protested tearfully. Startled by this reaction, Eris paused for a moment, long enough to remember that she'd trained for years on end so that she could fight beside Rudius as an equal. It occurred to her that these women had been there for him while she was absent. According to his letter, they'd helped him out many times over the years. She ended up feeling both a little jealous and a slight sense of superiority. She wouldn't be a burden. She could help Rudius against Orsted. With these loud, confident words, she convinced Roxy, Sylphie, and Ghislaine to accompany her as she chased after Rudius. And so Eris arrived in the nick of time. The group had hurried to the general area of the ambush, but ended up going a bit too far. Startled by a great explosion behind them, they rushed back to the sounds of combat. Eris had sprinted through the woods, searching desperately, her eyes straining to find Rudius. Finally, she'd spotted him, on the verge of death, and leapt in to defend him. Just like that, she was face to face with Orsted. Eris fixed her eyes on Orsted, and raised her weapon high above her head. This was no ordinary sword. Its name was the Phoenix Dragon Sword, and it was one of the 7 sword god blades. Ghislaine, watch my back! Orsted, in contrast, assumed no stance whatsoever. He simply stared at Eris with a suspicious expression on his face. No, it wasn't just her that had his attention. He was watching the fallen Rudius as well. The 2 women who'd rushed up to tend to him. Eris, in turn, began to study Orsted carefully. He was naked from the waist up and bleeding from 100 wounds. Blood trickled from his head as well, and he looked generally lethargic. His hair was charred at the ends, and there was a large bruise near his shoulder. He'd taken significant damage. However, there was also a long, curved sword in his right hand. Eris had never seen Orsted's blade before, and she didn't pretend to be an expert at evaluating weapons, but she could tell that it was something very special. Her own sword was a treasure of the sword god style, but even its power couldn't compare to whatever was hidden in that thing. The last time they'd faced each other, Orsted hadn't wielded anything of the sort. It hadn't been necessary, of course. He'd overwhelmed them all with his bare hands. Rudius had not only hurt the dragon god significantly, he'd forced the man to draw his sword. That fact sent a thrill through Eris's body. Now it's my turn to show what I can do. But I can't get impatient. Gotta buy some time first. With effort, Eris managed to suppress her excitement. She couldn't defeat Orsted. She'd realized that instinctively the very moment she jumped in to face him, and she'd accepted it quite easily. As a child, the gap between them had been so massive that she hadn't even been able to perceive it accurately. It was a bit like looking up at a tower hundreds of times taller than you. All you can really tell is that thing's really tall. Eris had believed she could climb all the way up that tower. But things were different now. She'd grown taller herself, and she could see Orsted's height for what it really was. Eris had grown much taller than she once was, but Orsted was taller still. Far taller. Looking at him was almost dizzying. It wasn't a height that she could hope to climb. Eris Boreas Grey Rat, is Rudius so precious to you? What of Luke? Luke? The man who was destined to become your husband. That's news to me. Eris dismissed Orsted's words easily enough. She didn't know who this Luke was, but the only man who was precious to her was Rudius. She didn't want anyone else, and she never would. I suppose it would be. Orsted still had not assumed a stance. He was simply watching as the others healed the injured Rudius. To all appearances, he'd completely let his guard down, but Eris knew that he was deliberately projecting that impression. He was leaving himself open, waiting for Eris to jump in and attack. Her mind flashed back to her final meeting with the sword god. Hang on a second, guys. After showing Eris into his room, the sword god, Galfalion, laid 3 swords in front of her and asked a simple question. What'll it be? Eris took the swords in her hands and examined them one by one. A part of her wanted to say that the sword she'd received on the demon continent long ago was all she needed. But as she grew taller, it had started to feel a bit too small for her. She'd honestly been wanting something a bit longer. Also, she had a suspicion its blade wasn't capable of harming Orsted. The average sword saint might have objected that leaning on the power of your weapon betrayed a lack of pride in your own skills. But Eris knew that pride wasn't worth shit in a fight to the death. This one. The sword Eris had chosen was the simplest of the three. Its blade was thin and only slightly curved. There was nothing ominous or intimidating about it. In fact, its clean, polished surface was very pleasant to the eye. The Phoenix Dragon sword it is. The weapon she'd chosen had been a gift from the first sword god from the legendary craftsman known as the Dragon Emperor. It was a sword made for sword gods, designed to maximize the potential of their offensive style. Nice choice, kid. Mind telling me why? This here's a magic sword. Doesn't look like it has any special abilities at a glance, but there's tiny channels of mana running all throughout the blade. They basically neutralize your opponent's battle aura. The Dragon God's aura is insanely strong, so the sword won't counteract it entirely, but it will soften him up a bit. In other words, it might be possible to pierce his defenses with this. I never warmed up to that one myself, but I bet you'll use it well. Incidentally, the reason that he'd only shown Eris 3 of the 7 sword god blades was that the other 4 were in use. He carried one himself, as did the 2 sword emperors and the sword king Ghislaine. The other 2 would no doubt end up in the hands of the style's 2 promising young sword saints once they had progressed a bit further in their training. Now then, let's get down to business. First rule of fighting Orsted. The North God paused for emphasis, staring Eris in the eye. Never make the first move. Eris didn't ask why. She knew the answer all too well herself. The man's water god style is divine level. He'll kill you in a single counterstroke. A bitter memory flashed through Eris's mind, a memory of being knocked flying with a single strike. Make him come to you. That's step 1. Practitioners of the sword god style always sought to land the first strike. To defeat them, you needed only to wait and counter it. According to the sword god, this simple strategy was the essence of Orsted's peerless technique, so Eris didn't move. She couldn't risk striking first against a master practitioner of the water god style. The sword god style was inherently aggressive, and the water god style defensive. That put her at a major disadvantage. The water god style's counterattacks did not fail, unless the student of the sword god style was superior to a certain degree. The water god style would be victorious. Eris had learned that lesson all too well thanks to her training with the Water King Isolde, and therefore she wasn't going to make the mistake of attacking first. Naturally, just standing around wasn't easy for the notoriously aggressive Mad Dog, but she was going to do it anyway. You're not coming? As Eris stood there, simply holding her stance, Orsted narrowed his eyes in puzzlement. The sword god style always sought to take the initiative. It was the foundation of all their techniques, and yet she was doing nothing whatsoever. All I need to do is wait, Eris replied quietly. When Rudius recovers, we can attack you together. Well, this is a surprise. Eris Boreas Greyrat speaks of fighting alongside allies? Another change, it seems. I did think it possible she might turn out differently, if she learned to cool her head and trained under the right master. Perhaps I was right. I'm not a Boreas anymore. It's just Eris Greyrat. A different woman than the Eris I know, then. Moving slowly and deliberately, Orsted finally assumed a stance of sorts. His left hand still dangling loosely at his side, he raised his right arm to point the tip of his blade straight at Eris. Very well. I'll come to you, then. Neither of them had done anything as yet. but the battle was now entering its second stage. Again, Eris thought back to her conversation with the sword god. Orsted can use the Sword of Light with his bare hand for a blade, but after all your practice with Nina, I think you know how to deal with that move. Just cut through his wrist before it reaches maximum velocity. That said, there's no telling if he'll use his right hand or his left hand. If he raises both of them, you're gonna have to guess. He might swing from above or below. Too. Pick left or right, high or low. That's step 2. Those had been Galfalian's exact words. Eris couldn't help but grimace slightly. Orsted had already drawn his sword. He would be using the true Sword of Light, not an approximation of it with his hand. The question was if she was capable of countering it. The answer, she decided, was yes. Orsted wasn't invincible. He was breathing somewhat roughly, and he was covered in wounds. Even now, blood dripped from the arm that held his sword. Also, he was only holding out his right arm, and his sword was low, just as she'd hoped. Pardon me. Despite his injuries, he was still holding his weapon in a single hand. He really thinks I'm nothing to worry about. Normally, this fact might have thrown Eris into a rage, but this time, she processed it quite calmly. It felt strange to her, considering all those angry years she'd spent demanding the world's respect and fear. But today, she was pleased to be underestimated. Sword God style, Sword of Light! Orsted's hand flicked through the air with fearsome speed, but simultaneously, Sword God style, Reflection Blade! Eris swung her own sword down as well. It was a movement she had practiced thousands upon thousands of times. It was also the best way to counteract the Sword of Light. With your own sword at maximum velocity, you targeted the slower-moving wrist of your opponent and cut through it before they could complete their swing. Orsted's sword spun in the air, along with his right hand. I got him! For a moment, Eris believed it was over, but before she could follow up, Orsted executed an astonishing response. Reaching upward, he caught his severed hand, pressed it to his wrist, and instantly reattached it. In the same moment, he took advantage of his upward movement to fire off a spinning kick. Eris managed to dodge this bizarre attack with a half-step backwards, but only because the sword god had warned her there was a possibility he might try something of the kind. Orsted immediately followed up with a slicing bare hand strike, but Eris struck it down with her sword. Neither of these hefty strikes had been a Sword of Light. As a result, Eris's attack had not injured Orsted. Her blade had struck home with a clang, successfully redirecting his hand, but it hadn't left a scratch on his skin. A moment later, Orsted's sword thumped blade first into the ground behind him. At a glance, it appeared that the man's right hand was as good as new, and the injuries Rudius had inflicted on him had also been healed. In the blink of an eye, he'd restored himself completely, with some incredibly powerful variety of healing magic. What a monster, Eris thought calmly to herself. Her last attack may not have been a Sword of Light, but its speed and power had been considerable. Yet it had bounced right off the man. The Sword of Light was her only means of cutting through his holy dragon aura, even with the Phoenix Dragon Sword. I see the sword god's cunning in your tactics. You must have been highly favored student, Eris Greyrat. Eris had returned her sword to its position over her head. Her mind was clear and her emotions steady. But instead of swinging his own blade, Orsted now unleashed a different kind of attack. Did Galfalian tell you stories of his exploit as you lay in his bed? When all was said and done, Eris respected the sword god deeply. Over the last few years, Galfalian had thrown himself into the task of training her and entrusted her with his dream. Their relationship had been a purely platonic one. He was simply her master, and she was simply his student. He had trained her because their interests were aligned. Ordinarily, Eris would have been infuriated at Orsted's crude suggestion to the contrary, especially since he'd spoken so that the other three women and Rudius could hear. But her master had given her a clear warning. If things start going well, Orsted might try to needle you. Don't you go and fall for it, you hear me? The sword god had anticipated Orsted's attempt at provocation in advance, and so it had no effect on Eris whatsoever. She had no reason to be angry. Orsted was just proving that Golfalion had his number. I see, you truly have grown stronger. As Eris brushed off his taunt with a snort, Orsted murmured these words in an almost melancholy tone, and slowly raised both of his hands. At the sight of this, Eris recalled the last piece of advice the sword god had given her. For whatever reason, the man can't go all out. He's a master with magic and the sword, but he'll try to settle things with just his aura and his martial arts, especially when he's fighting someone with a style he's real familiar with. He starts off with the kicks and punches, then goes to magic if he really has to. But when he's up against something new, for some reason, he tends to sit back and study techniques he's seen for the first time. That just might be the chink in his armor. Right now, Orsted wasn't going in for the kill. He seemed to be slowly toying with her, like a cat batting cruelly at an exhausted mouse. Eris ground her teeth audibly, took her left hand from the Phoenix dragon sword and reached for the unmarked blade she'd received in the meagered village. Her right hand held the Phoenix dragon sword above her head, but her left was now gripping the nameless sword, still sheathed behind her waist. It was a strange stance, all the more because the sword god style had no concept of dual wielding. Using two swords at once was a technique of the North god style. More importantly, while the sword Eris held above her head was a deadly magic weapon, she wasn't capable of using the Sword of Light with a single hand. And while there were techniques that involved drawing a sword directly into a strike, her reverse grip on the unmarked sword made the best of them impossible. Her stance, in other words, was irrational. It made no sense at all. It was the sort of blunder that a sword king and a master of the sword god style was supposed to make. Wasn't supposed to make. It says was. For that very reason, Orsted stopped moving. With his hand still poised in the air, he studied Eris carefully. His eyes were entirely focused on her, to the exclusion of Rudius, who was currently being healed behind her. She had his complete attention for the moment, but she couldn't just stay passive now. Unless she took some action, Orsted would step forward to attack. Fortunately, Eris had improvised a certain move for this very moment. It was based on a technique she'd picked up from the North Emperor Albert, although she'd only seen it once. She had trained herself to execute this move with a single hand, at maximum velocity in the very same instant that she drew her sword. It was an imperfect technique, but it was highly lethal nonetheless. When their back's against the wall, a student of the North God style will throw their sword. Eris' left hand moved roughly, but with confidence. Her fingers caught on the sword's hilt, pulling it free, and in the same motion, as her arm whipped forward, she hurled it at Orsted. The unmarked sword that had accompanied her through so many trials and tribulations cut cleanly through the air, its point aimed straight at her foe. The momentum of the throw carried Eris' left hand upward to the sword she still held aloft. As swiftly as she possibly could, she grabbed the Phoenix Dragon sword, and without a moment's hesitation, she swung it down with both hands, executing a flawless Sword of Light. Her fearsome attack flew right past the airborne sword, slicing toward the top of Orsted's head along the shortest possible trajectory at the greatest possible speed. There was a sharp clang. Holding her sword in its follow-through position, Eris clicked her tongue in irritation. Orsted had caught its blade between his hands, and the unnamed sword had struck his body solidly, only to deflect off his holy dragon aura and fly back behind her. You've exceeded my expectations, but I suppose it's over now. Nope! Her blade still frozen in Orsted's hands. Eris shouted her reply as she turned toward where the unmarked sword had fallen. Rudius was standing there. The others had finished healing her. We're just getting started. It took Eris an instant to process what her eyes were seeing. It was Rudius, of course, and he was standing, but there were dark circles under his eyes, and his light brown hair had gone white. His legs were trembling weakly. His face was deathly pale, and his lips were purple. Roxy and Sylphie were supporting him on either side. Getting started? With what exactly? Rudius was in no condition to fight, to say the least. His mana was exhausted, his strength was gone, and even his willpower had failed him. He was battered and bruised, both physically and emotionally. You'll see soon enough. The sight of him was enough to steel Eris' resolve. 3 times, she inhaled deeply and exhaled. As air flooded into her lungs, she gripped her sword more tightly, conscious of every bead of sweat on her palms. Clenching her back teeth tightly for an instant, she licked at her lips. Finally, she tensed her stomach muscles and roared as loudly as she could. You 3! Get Rudius out of here! Right now! Eris' voice thundered through the air. I'll hold Orsted here, even if it kills me. She meant that quite literally. Sylphie felt the strength of Eris' determination. She'd sensed the same thing from her companions on the desperate journey to Renoa with Princess Ariel. Eris was prepared to die. Wait! I'll fight too! Sylphie's legs were trembling, but she shouted the words nonetheless. Orsted was terrifying beyond measure. This was their first meeting, but she knew that to stand against him would mean death. Still, the choice wasn't a difficult one, not with Rudius' life on the line. If anything, she was full of regret that she'd ever let the man she loved go off alone to fight a monster such as this. The words, "Are you trying to get him killed?" still rang in her ears. That had never been her intention. She'd seen Rudius regain his usual energy and focus, despite his fears, and she'd assumed it would all work out fine. After all, he was an incredibly powerful mage, and he always made it back to her in the end. Also, the magic armor had seemed overwhelming. She'd convinced herself that nothing and no one could defeat that thing. It was only her confidence in Rudius that had held her back. Eris stared silently into Sylphie's eyes for just a moment, and then nodded. All right, you take the back line. Ghislaine, get Rudius and Roxy out of here. Eris, my job is to protect you! Now it was the beast-folk Sword King's turn to protest. Ghislaine had watched Eris fight her way through life. She'd watched her train with single-minded focus, and for that reason she stood back and watched this battle unfold, without interfering or objecting. She'd seen that as her way of repaying Eris' deceased grandfather, Soros, to whom she owed so much. What, you're not going to listen to me? I'm telling you to protect the people I care about. I won't do it. I could never face Lord Soros or Philip if I'd let you die here. But now the girl was planning to take a path that ended in certain death, and Ghislaine couldn't allow that. Her refusal was reflexive rather than reasoned. She wasn't very good at thinking and avoided it when possible. Stop it! We all need to run! Given her pregnancy, Roxy was aware she wouldn't be much use in combat. She'd come here knowing that she would only be a burden if it came to that. Her plan had been to drag Rudius to the horses waiting outside the forest and then flee as quickly as possible. There was a chance such strenuous movement might cause a miscarriage, but helping Rudius escape was her first priority. In all honesty, she hadn't given much thought to what would come after that. For now, she believed they simply had to run and regroup in safety. Eris and Ghislaine argued, Sylphie and Roxy braced themselves to act, and as he took all of this in, out of the corner of his eyes, Orsted let out a long, loud sigh. Everyone except Rudius went on guard. 4 sets of eyes glared fiercely at Orsted. Indifferent to their gazes, the dragon god raised his voice to a bellow. "Rudius Greyrat!" Rudius flinched visibly at the sound of his name. "So long as you serve the man god, I will not allow you to escape. Even if it means killing everyone here and all those waiting for you in the city, I will hunt you down and take your life." Rudius was trembling now, more obviously than before, his knees shaking uncontrollably. He stared down at the ground in front of him. "While I place no trust in the man-god's words, given what he told you, I will also abduct your children once you're dead." At these words, the trembling stopped. The fire had flickered back into Rudius's eyes. Punching at his quaking legs with his left hand, he reached out with his right to grab his staff from Roxy, forgetting that he'd lost that hand not long ago. Thrown off balance, he might have fallen to the ground if Roxy hadn't quickly caught him. But even as he leaned against her, his eyes were glaring fiercely at Orsted. There was murder in his gaze. "However, your imitation of the fighting god armor, the bountiful mana bestowed upon you by the Lapless aspect, and your immunity to my curse may yet prove useful." Huh. At these words, the rage in Rudius's eyes faltered slightly, and as he looked on with a dubious, wary expression, the dragon god continued to speak. "Betray the man god! Join me instead!" 2 people reacted instantly on these words. "You've got to be joking! Rudy, don't listen to him!" Eris and Sylphie were both convinced that Orsted was lying. They had no clear reason to believe this, but they did. Ghislaine and Roxy held their silence, but they too felt that Orsted was up to something, that some trap lay hidden in his words. "Should you accept my offer, I will overlook this unprovoked ambush and restore your injured arm to its original condition." But Rudius was an exception. He had noticed something about the tone of Orsted's voice. He had realized that the man's throat was trembling slightly, and that fact was nagging at him. "I am the dragon god. Once you are under my protection, the man god will not find it so easy to meddle with you." Doubt and temptation mingled in Rudius's eyes. "Rest assured, he cannot hear what we speak of at this very moment. If your allegiance to the man-god was unwilling, I would think this a most enticing offer. Choose now, Rudius Greyrat. Will you side with the man-god and lose everything at my hands? Or will you join me and fight against him? You are unaffected by my curse. This is a choice you are capable of making." Rudius's gaze met Orsted's. First he exhaled slowly, and then he studied the face of the dragon god, as if searching for an answer in it. He was trying to see what was hidden behind the man's stony expression, but of course, his eyes could tell him nothing of the kind. The silence stretched for several seconds. "Rudy?" Finally, Rudius staggered out of Roxy's arms and began to walk slowly forward. With every step, he ran the risk of falling on his face. He lurched to the side and steadied himself on Ghislaine's shoulder. When he lost his balance, he grabbed hold of Sylphie, who'd rushed up to catch him. Eventually, he made his way past Eris, and then he fell to his knees on Orsted's feet. He made no move to rise. Instead, he looked up at the man before him and spoke. "Is there really a way to protect my family from the man-god?" "There is. He possesses great knowledge of the future, but he is not all-seeing, much less all-powerful." "Is it absolutely reliable?" "Not absolutely, no. I would not pretend to know the full breadth of his powers." Orsted made no definite promise. He didn't even offer soothing words of reassurance. Nonetheless, Rudius looked up at him with eyes of a man seeking salvation. There were tears in the corner of those eyes, although it was hard to say what had inspired them. One way or the other, he had made his decision. "I'll serve you. Help me. Please." And so, on this day, Rudius Greyrat entered the service of the Dragon God. That's chapter 9 in the books. Only took like 30 minutes, 40 minutes. I don't know. I don't know how long I was goofing off at the beginning. But yeah, dude. Craziness. Imagine Sylvie actually following through with her intentions of what she'd do if she ever saw Eris. That's true. Pile on. Get in there. Rudius, I can't beat the Dragon God. I lost my arms and I'm out of mana. I can't do anything. Orsted, you're kids. Rudius, I'm going to kill you. Like, you're not wrong. That's very kind of on brand with what just happened there, Saiyan Fang. As one does. All right. Curious to get your thoughts on what you guys thought of this chapter. So go ahead and put those down there and let me know what you thought. I'm trying to change up my voice for different characters between Galfalion and Orsted. I'm not sure if this is quite the right voice for the man god, or for the Dragon God Orsted, but I'm honestly incapable of. I don't think I can copy like the vibe of his Japanese voice. I'd have to listen to it more. Maybe I'll listen to it. Richard Spurdia. I don't know, dude. I'm curious. I haven't actually watched the dub. I'm curious what Orsted sounds like in the dub. Is it like a deep, low, kind of aggressive sounding voice too? Maybe it should be something down here like this, but a little bit more gravelly. I've been kind of giving him too much rasp. Maybe I should back off of the rasp. What do you guys think? Discuss it with me down in the comments, man. Put it in the comments on YouTube and let me know in the chat on Twitch. I'm curious what you think the Orsted voice should sound like. Because obviously, by the fact that Rudy has joined Orsted, we're going to be getting a lot more Orsted dialogue. So maybe I should go with a voice that doesn't kind of scratch my throat. It's interesting to see how Eris' fighting style has evolved after her training. Yeah, but it's also very much a lot of the advice that Galfalion gave her about facing Orsted as well. So I don't think it's just that. Santa voice. Ho, ho, ho. Yeah, no. I'm not giving him a Russian accent. I'm not abridging Mushoku Tensei light novels, so that's not happening. So you can take your Russian accent idea and throw it in the bin where it goes. Because no. Alright. That having been said, we've gone almost 40 minutes. Should probably get started on the next thing. Orsted's theme is a remix of Ukrainian Bell Carol, if you say so. All right. Moving on. Chapter 10. Eris Greyrat, Part 1. Just a little over 111 pages until the end of this book. So we're 66% of the way through, 2/3 through this book. Let's see if we can do this. We got 2 hours and 10 minutes. Let's see how we can do. I woke up early and accompanied Norn for a run, followed by some practice swings. Made it back in time to hug Sylvie as she tended Lucy and said good morning to Lilia and Aisha in the living room. Combed and braided Roxy's hair while she struggled to wake up. Found Zenith in the garden, quietly watching our pet treant bite. Let her know that breakfast was ready, and then had a big meal with the entire family. In other words, I was back to my old peaceful routine. Of course, it wasn't like nothing had ever happened. I really had tried to kill the dragon god Orsted. I'd been utterly defeated, but somehow made it out alive. I glanced down at my hands. They were a testament to that fact. When I squeezed them into fists, I could feel my fingertips pressing against my palm. On both sides. On that day, after I bowed to Orsted and swore my loyalty, he made good on his promise to use his healing magic on me. My severed right arm was regenerated in moments, along with an added bonus, the left hand that Manatite Hydra took from me some time earlier. Orsted proceeded to cast some other spell on me, handed me a bracelet he'd been wearing on his arm, and departed with the words, "I'll be in touch once you've regained your mana." Even now, I was wearing the bracelet in question on my left arm. I wasn't clear on its function, though. Maybe it would accelerate my mana regeneration or somehow prevent the man god from spying on me. The latter seemed plausible. 10 days had passed since the battle, but the man god hadn't appeared in my dreams yet. And Orsted had said something about protecting me from his influence. Then again, for all I knew, it was just something he gave out to anyone under his command, like some sort of official dragon god badge. In any case, Orsted had defeated me, and I was now his subordinate. I'd betrayed the man god and joined forces with his enemy. I'd probably be wearing this bracelet for the rest of my life. I had no regrets about the choice I'd made. To be honest, it felt kind of nice to have betrayed that faceless bastard. At the moment, I was more relieved than anxious. There was no turning back at this point. Even if Orsted turned out to be a real piece of work himself, I couldn't double-cross him. The die had been cast. It was always possible that I was just doing exactly what the man god wanted, yes, but it was too late to worry about that now. In all honesty, though, I had a gut feeling that Orsted would prove more trustworthy than the man god. Something about him reminded me of Richard in a way. He didn't have Richard's strong sense of pride or his affection for children, but unlike the man god who just watched events passively from a distance, he seemed like the type who tried to punch his way through his problems. One way or another, there was a big weight off my shoulders. I was breathing easier these days than I had in months. The road ahead was likely going to be a bumpy one, but it felt as if I'd made it over a steep mountain. Incidentally, I'd spoken with Roxy and Sylphie after Orsted left. Sylphie was sobbing the entire time, and Roxy gave me a stern talking to. They both insisted they would have stopped me if I'd been more honest about how truly dangerous Orsted was, and expressed their fears about my new alliance with him, but I justified it as the only option I had in the short term, and they grudgingly accepted that argument. After that, we headed straight back home, where I told my family I was fine, and then went to bed immediately. Physically exhausted and completely out of mana, I ended up sleeping for an entire day. When I finally woke, I visited all my friends and allies to let them know that I'd lost to Orsted and joined his service. All of them, Perugius looked the most relieved. Understandable for sure. Even with a flying fortress, you wouldn't want to make an enemy out of that guy. Everyone looked kind of startled when they saw me, by the way. Eventually, I found out it was because my hair had gone white. According to Perugius, this was a common side effect of using up a massive quantity of mana in a short period of time. I'd never understood why Sylphie's hair had changed color after the displacement incident, but that probably explained it. However, I was already seeing some brown at the roots of my hair. Unlike Sylphie's, my change would likely be a temporary one. Not that I really minded either way, since we had a matching look going at the moment. There was no telling how the man god might respond to my betrayal, so I'd been on edge at first. So far, though, nothing out of the ordinary had happened, and I was feeling fine. My body was recovering from this ordeal, and I could sense my supply of mana gradually refilling itself. On that note, it seemed like Orsted knew the secret behind my unusually large mana capacity. He'd mentioned something called a lapless aspect that was, whatever that was. Well, he'd probably tell me more at some point if it was important. I just have to be patient for now. Putting all that aside, there was one thing about my routine daily life that had changed considerably. "Refill, please!" "Sorry, Eris, there's no more soup left." "Really? wasn't much at all. We had a new regular at our dinner table, a tall, red-headed woman with an appetite, by which I meant Eris Greyrat, naturally. She'd followed us back to Sharia, occupied our guest room on her own initiative, and started living with us. Ghislaine was staying at a nearby inn, incidentally. I wasn't clear on why. Maybe seeing Zenith in her current state was too much of a shock for her. Or maybe she was trying to give us some space. One way or another, it was only Eris who'd moved in. Eris did wander off every now and then, but in general, she spent most of her time hanging around the house. She watched Sylphie cook, Roxy preparing for her classes, or Aisha and Lilia doing housework. Sometimes she'd even stare at Zenith and Lucy for no apparent reason. When she wasn't out and about, observing members of the family seemed to be her default activity. It didn't escape my notice that she usually had a small, troubled frown on her face while she observed Sylphie and Roxy in particular. Eris had changed a lot since the last time I'd seen her. I'm not sure how to put this, but she had a real presence now. She was tall for a woman, for one thing, and she carried herself with confidence. Her style suited her, too. She wore the same kind of leather jacket as Ghislaine, flexible black pants and a white top over a dark undershirt. It was an outfit she could fight in, but it also happened to underscore just how fit she was. That's not to say that she'd turned into a mass of muscle, though. If anything, her body was lean and lithe. To be honest, once I started looking at her, it was a real challenge to stop. It didn't hurt that her breasts were large, her waist was thin, and her butt was curvy. But over the last 5 years, her once childish face had also acquired a sharp, striking beauty. In every respect, she was obviously a young woman now, rather than the girl I'd known. Maybe that was part of why I was finding it so hard to start a conversation with her. It might have been easier to catch up with her right after the battle, but I'd missed that window of opportunity while I was going around the city telling everyone about the situation. The more basic issue, though, was that my heart started racing every time I looked at her for too long. I told myself a dozen times that I needed to talk to her, but somehow I just couldn't seem to find the right moment. Whenever I started to say something, that intense gaze would lock onto me. The pitter-pattering of my chest would kick into overdrive, and I'd find myself averting my eyes. It always took quite some time for my heart to stop pounding afterward. What a mysterious phenomenon. Was this terror I was feeling? Okay, yeah, just kidding. I knew exactly what was going on. I was in love. I'd fallen hard for Eris. For the second time, I guess. She sure won me over quickly, right? In my defense, though, she had dashed in to save me when I thought all hope was lost. Held the dragon god Orsted himself at bay and risked her life to protect mine. Looked damn good doing it, too. All in all, I couldn't really blame myself. Right now, I was basically an infatuated schoolgirl. I was no longer Rudius. I was Woodius. That's literally what it says. Just roll with it. Given the way I felt about Eris, the next step seemed to be clear. Sylphie and Roxy had already given me their approval. There was no reason I couldn't just ask her to marry me. But maybe it wasn't quite that simple. I'd only learned this from Aisha after returning home, but Eris had spent the last few years undergoing a harsh training regimen in the Sword Sanctum solely so that she could fight Orsted at my side. Our battle against him at the Red Worm's lower jaw had left a deep impression on her, and when she'd seen me experimenting with his disturbed magic spell afterward, she'd assumed that I was planning to defeat him someday in the future. Personally, I thought Eris and I were pretty closely matched back then, but she decided that she wasn't strong enough to fight alongside me as an equal and went off to train with the very best. From her perspective, I had basically betrayed her. She'd gone off on a long overseas business trip and then returned to find her no-good cheater of a boyfriend shacked up with 2 other women. There had been many misunderstandings involved, of course, and I'd explained all that in my letter. You never knew for sure with Eris, but I assumed she understood the situation. Still, that didn't mean she was ready to accept it. Considering her personality, I half expected her to charge at me with a kitchen knife one of these days. Under the circumstances, it felt a little wrong to just ask her to marry me anyway. Also, she was behaving kind of strangely in general. I couldn't figure out what she was thinking, to be honest. Not to put too fine a point on it, but the heiress I knew was kind of a willful, headstrong brat. She tended to charge right into action without a thought for the consequences. I'd sort of been expecting something along the lines of, "I love you, Rudius. That means you get to marry me. Get in my room. We're making love all night long. You hear that? Or, you hear that, everyone? Rudius is mine. Get those other women out of here." To my surprise, though, she hadn't said anything of the kind. She wasn't really asserting herself at all, in fact. I'd never seen her this quiet and subdued. I did have a theory that could explain all this. 2 weeks ago, Eris had risked her life to protect me from Orsted, but at that point, she was still clinging to some unrealistic fantasies about me. Up till that day, she'd probably believed that I'd spent the last 5 years rigorously training the way she had. Of course, that wasn't even close to being true. I'd put in some effort to grow stronger, but nothing remotely comparable to what she did. Orsted had ruthlessly beaten me down, and Eris had arrived just in time to see me crawling pathetically through the dirt. Just to top things off, I'd also picked up 2 wives, and there were some less than flattering rumors about me going around the city. It wouldn't exactly be surprising if she'd felt a little disillusioned. Maybe she wasn't saying anything because she was planning to leave soon. The more I thought about the possibility, the more nervous I got about starting the conversation from my end. I was scared she'd reject me outright, honestly. What if she fixed those steely eyes on me and said, "I don't give a damn about you anymore," or something? The idea was just depressing. In a sense, it was probably what I deserved, but it would still feel like a punch to the gut. Then again, if she wanted to say that, wouldn't she have done so sooner? Yeah, but I don't know. Ugh! One way or the other, we obviously needed to talk this through. I had to grow a spine and ask her what her plans were, or so I kept telling myself, but I just couldn't seem to find the right moment. I couldn't bring myself to say anything, and Eris was keeping quiet too, and so the days kept slipping by with no progress on that front whatsoever. If at all possible, I wanted to clear things up between us before Orsted got in touch with me, but I was at a loss as to how to make that happen. It was starting to feel like the two of us were going to just keep living separately in the same house without ever figuring this out. As I was preoccupied with these thoughts, Roxy came over and asked me an unexpected question. "So, when are you planning to hold the wedding party for Eris?" "The wedding party?" "Right. I mean, you held one for me, so I assume you'll do the same for her. I'll take that day off work for it. So I was hoping you could let me know when it's going to happen." I found myself at a loss for words. After an awkward pause, Roxy looked me in the eyes and frowned. "Don't tell me you haven't even talked to her about this yet. We discussed it at great length before she showed up, didn't we?" The expression on my face was probably uncomfortable, to say the least. Roxy was right, of course. I'd already settled the matter with my family. Everyone was ready to accept Eris. Aisha had been willing from the start, but even Norn was treating her like part of the family now. In fact, I'd noticed her and Eris chatting happily about Regerd a couple of times now. They seemed to get along much better than you might have expected. Nobody was against this marriage. The only thing holding it up was my cowardice. "Rudy, you can't put this off forever," Roxy said, pointing a finger in the air in her best stern big sister pose. "And you really shouldn't keep Eris waiting any longer." "Waiting? Of course, she's expecting you to say, 'Jump into my arms,' or what have you." Just to emphasize the point, Roxy threw her arms wide open at me. It was extremely cute. You really think Eris wants to hear that from me? Are you sure you're not just thinking of your fantasies? What? Come on, don't tease me. You need to take this seriously, Rudy. Roxy threw her hands into the air in exasperation, puffing at her cheeks sulkily. I'd pivoted to teasing her on reflex, but I did need to give this some thought. Was Eris really waiting patiently for me to make the first move? That didn't really seem like her style. Then again, Roxy had never led me wrong before. She was the kind of god whose advice you could actually rely on. Now that I had her pushing me forward, I had no justifiable reason to hesitate. It was time for me to show a little courage. I was going to approach Eris, tell her how I felt, and see what she had to say about it. If she laughed in my face, I'd just have to get Sylphie and Roxy to cheer me up. First things first, though. Throwing my arms open wide, I declared, "Jump into my arms, Roxy!" in the most enthusiastic tone. "You're not even listening to me, are you?" Roxy's voice trailed off toward the end of her sentence. She looked me in the face, then glanced furtively around, confirming that there was no one around. After a moment, she lowered her hands to shoulder level and took an adorable little hop into my arms. I could feel her slightly conspicuous belly pressing up against against my stomach. "Easy there, princess. Wouldn't want to jostle the baby in your belly too much." "Not to worry," Roxy murmured softly in my ear. "They need a little exercise now and then if they're going to stay in shape." Was that really how it worked? Well, if she said so, I'd have to defer to the expert. Deciding this was a good opportunity for some intimate family bonding time, I lowered myself into a chair and deposited Roxy on my lap. But as I did so, I had the strange feeling I was being watched. There was someone lurking in the doorway, half hidden in the crouch of a noisy housekeeper. Someone with eyes that glimmered like an angry tiger's. It was Eris. "Gah! What's the matter, Rudy?" As I shrieked and clutched Roxy tightly in my arm, Eris turned her eyes away from mine and disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. She hadn't said a word, but she'd still managed to absolutely terrify me. Okay, maybe I'll talk to her tomorrow. The next day, I wandered through the house in search of Eris, hoping to finally have the conversation I'd been putting off for so long. It didn't take long for me to find her. She was out in the yard doing practice swings. For some reason, Norn was practicing right beside her. Wasn't she supposed to be at school? Every once in a while, Eris paused to say something like, No, do it like this!" It looked like she was trying to help. Oh, no, she's not shouting it. No, do it like this. It looked like she was trying to help my little sister with her form. "I keep telling you, that's not right. Why aren't you getting it? That's not very helpful. What exactly am I doing wrong? What exactly? Eris had never been too good at putting these things into words, so it was a little skeptical. So I was a little skeptical Norn would get anything out of this lesson. Some people with too much natural talent don't even understand all the things they're doing instinctively, you know? But to my surprise, well, you're not using your left hand enough. If you start swinging your sword using just your right arm, the blade's going to slip off target. Huh? Wait, am I hearing things? Try to focus on the movements of your left hand. Pretend you're only using that arm. That should make your swings much cleaner. Hold on. Is this really Eris talking? Maybe she's just flapping her mouth and Ghislaine's dubbing over her. Oh, right. I think I get it now. Well, good. I hope so. Smiling at each other, the two of them got right back to their practice swings, and Norn's looked just a little better than before. Well, I guess she is a sword king now. Ghislaine had told me once that you couldn't reach that rank on instincts or talent alone. Eris must have learned how to think logically about her technique on her way up the ladder. In any case, Eris's swings sure were quick. I couldn't even see a blur past the very base of her blade. Her movements were also, well, beautiful. Her blade whispered slightly when she raised it and cut silently through the air as she brought it down. Only when it stopped at the very bottom of her swing could you hear a gentle whoosh. It was an entrancing sight. Watching her in action made me want to sigh with admiration. Oh man, that look of total concentration on her face. The beads of sweat on her forehead, her taut body, her lean body, her muscles rippling with exertion. Oh my God, how could I have overlooked this? Every time Eris swung her sword down, a certain springy part of her anatomy would quiver slightly. This wasn't swaying or bouncing, to be clear. They were just jiggling a little. Very subtle. Probably because her swings were so efficient that her upper body wasn't moving much at all. That undershirt she was wearing seemed to offer some support, but on closer examination, I had the feeling she wasn't wearing any chest armor underneath it. There we go. Ah, there you go. Alrighty. With every swing, my eyes were glued a little harder to this splendid phenomenon. I couldn't escape her gravitational field. All of a sudden, Eris' breast stopped moving. That is to say, she stopped swinging her sword. I glanced up and found that she was looking my way. Her legs were spread to shoulder width, her chin was in the air, and there was a nasty frown on her face. All she had to do was fold her arms, and you'd have her signature intimidating pose from back in the day. Just as this thought occurred to me, I noticed what she was holding. The very real, very sharp sword she'd used to fend off Orsted. I chose to make a prompt tactical retreat. You wouldn't want to start an important discussion with someone carrying a deadly weapon, right? Just wouldn't be good manners. 2 hours later, when I figured her training regimen should be over for the day, I went looking for Eris once again. She wasn't in the yard anymore. When I checked the entrance to our bath, though, I only saw Norn's clothes folded up in the dressing area. Naturally, I didn't peep into the bath itself. After looking all throughout the house, though, I couldn't find Eris anywhere. Maybe she'd changed clothes right away and gone out on some errand? Waiting for her to come back was always an option, of course, but then again, there was no reason we had to talk about this inside the house. If she was out and about, I should try to catch up with her. With that thought in mind, I headed over to the bathroom to relieve myself before I left. Just as I was reaching for the knob, though, the door swung quickly open from inside. Ah! Puh! All of a sudden, I found myself mere inches away from a very startled-looking Eris. At point-blank range, her strong facial features were even more strikingly beautiful. Her waves of vivid red hair, slightly damp, flowed over her shoulders and down toward her bust. Her sweat-drenched undershirt clung closely to her body, offering an excellent view of her cleavage. That deep, dark valley drew my gaze with all the force of a black hole. Like all valleys, it was flanked by a pair of hills, and what hills they were. Her sweaty shirt revealed their lovely contours perfectly, right down to the sharp little points at their summits. It seemed that my eyes had died and gone to eyeball heaven. What are you looking at? There was an uncertain look in Eris's face now. It was extremely cute. Reflexively, I reached out and touched the great mounds before me, exploring their gentle slopes and slightly harder peaks. Oh, angel soft. A split second later, Eris' shoulder blurred into motion and I was knocked unconscious. Dumbass. When I came to, the back of my head was resting on something slightly firm. It was harder than my usual pillow, but it had a nice warmth to it, and it felt kind of supple. Also, someone seemed to be stroking me on the head. I eventually realized this was a lap pillow situation. Unfortunately, my mind was still half asleep at this point. Num num. I can't eat another bite. Pretending to be completely asleep, I turned over to bury my face in the triangular space where my human pillow's legs met her body. Then I took a nice deep breath and started groping her backside. Yeah! This isn't Sophie's butt. Hers is a lot smaller, almost palm-sized. This doesn't smell like Roxy either. She has a nice, comforting scent, but this one's a little sweaty, and for some reason it's setting off alarm bells in the back of my head. It's not half bad, though. Makes me feel a little nostalgic. At this point, I snapped fully awake, slowly opened my eyes. I turned to look at the woman I was lying on. From the other side of two shapely mountains, a pair of intense eyes were glaring down at me. Eris reached down and gripped my head firmly with her hand. Oh God, it's all over. She's going to twist my head right off my neck. Goodbye, Sylphie. Goodbye, Roxy. I'm sorry I have to leave you so soon. To my surprise, though, Eris didn't actually murder me. Instead, she started stroking my hair with the strong but gentle movements. Making myself as small as possible, I studied her carefully, but she was pouting, and her face was red, and she wouldn't look me in the eye, but she didn't actually seem that angry. Miss Eris? It's just Eris. Okay, then. I'm sorry, Eris. As soon as I apologized, her grip on my head grew noticeably more forceful. Farewell, my beloved family. We'll meet again someday. It's all right, Eris said after a moment. I'm sorry, too. Oh. Well, okay, then. I read your letter and everything. It wasn't easy for you after I left, right? My head was still firmly in Eris's grip, but I managed to nod anyway. I wasn't enough of an adult to add, none of that was your fault. The two of us had badly misunderstood each other back then. I was hurt at the time, and now she was going through through something similar. Hey, Rudius? What is it? Eris fell silent for a long moment. She looked uncertain about how to complete her sentence. We knew there was a lot that needed to be said, but we couldn't seem to find the right words. The 5 years we'd spent apart had been very long ones for both of us. You do, love those two, don't you? Yeah, I love them both. At my quick, clear reply, Eris's grip on my head tightened slightly. You like them more than me, right? Yeah. Eris' face crumpled with sadness. Shit, I wish I hadn't said that. I can't go comparing them to each other. I love Sophie and Roxy very much, but I'd fallen for Eris too. There was really no point denying that at this point. Do you hate me now? Of course not! It's just been a really long time since we saw each other. Sometimes I feel a little awkward around you, that's all. You know, I still like you a lot, Rudius, and I want you to love me back. Eris' face hadn't gone as red as her Eris' face had gone as red as her hair. Was I hearing things, or had she just confessed her love for me? Yeah. Surely there wasn't any other way to interpret that. The question was how to reply. I knew what my final answer was, but before I could deliver it, I needed to make sure that she really understood what she was getting herself into here. You know, I have 2 wives already, right? Scowling, Eris abruptly rose to her feet. Rudely ejected from her lap, my head bounced off the wooden floor. It seemed we were in the living room. There was no one else around. Sylphie and Norn were both at home, but maybe they were trying to give us some space at the moment. As I crawled onto my hands and knees, Eris glared at me from above. Her arms were folded, her legs were open to shoulder width, and her chin was in the air. It was the exact same pose she'd used on me from the very first time we met. Step outside, Rudius. I want a duel. Huh? I squeaked, clambering to my feet as I brushed the dust off my clothes. A duel? That's right. If you win, I'll leave for good. But if I win... Eris paused to point a finger straight at my face. If I win, then you have to love me too. Things had taken kind of a strange turn. All I could manage was a nod. I mean, yeah, they're both weird and awkward and on completely opposite pages. Rudy doesn't know how to pick his words because he's an idiot. And Eris doesn't know because she's awkward. So a dumbass and somebody who's kind of emotionally awkward and doesn't know how to express herself. I think I might actually be able to pull this off. All right, we're on 270, or god damn it, 237. 73%. So we moved up quite a bit. Way past where I was expecting. But you know, it is what it is. Less than 100 to go. Almost at 90. 92 pages, I think, from the end. Since these are kind of back to back, I'm just going to jump into the next one. Chapter 11. Eris Greyrat, Part 2. Somehow I found myself facing off against Eris just outside the city walls. There was no crowd to witness our duel, but Ghislaine was standing nearby. Eris had dragged her into this on our way out of Sharia. Given that she'd brought a referee along, she probably wasn't planning to actually kill me, right? Eris wasn't saying anything at all. She was just watching me with her hand on the hilt of her sword. On closer examination, I could see that it was trembling slightly. But for all I knew, that was just from excitement. What was I supposed to do here? Should I take this fight seriously? To be honest, I was okay with losing. It actually seemed preferable. I'd fallen for Eris. Sure, I just told her that I liked Sylphie and Roxy more, but that was more of a reflexive response than anything else. I couldn't actually rank my feelings for them in a real sense. Sylphie, Roxy, and Eris were all wonderful, lovable women in their own ways. It might sound indecisive, but that was just the kind of no-good bum I was. I had an overactive sex drive and a total inability to stay loyal to a single person. Honestly, a part of me was already drooling at the idea of hopping into bed with this new, sexy version of Eris. If she wanted me to love her, I was more than happy to oblige. It wasn't like that would be cheating at this point, right? I mean, I did love her, and there was nothing wrong with that. Damn it. What could be more natural than wanting to make such an attractive woman yours? Come at me, you Millis church fools. I'll marry as many people as I want. Anyway, that was all well and good, but the question was how Eris would react if I forfeited this duel. What if she took that as some sort of humiliating insult? What if she decided I was just a coward? Eris had become a master swordswoman, so she could protect me from Orsted. Eris had become a master swordswoman, so she could protect me from Orsted. Maybe I needed to demonstrate my strength to her and show her that I'd improved as well. In reality, I hadn't trained nearly as hard as her, but that wasn't the point. She probably wanted me to take this seriously and put up the best fight I could. If I lost, that was fine by me. If I won, I could always ask her to marry me anyway. Maybe I could try out a line like, "All right, you're mine now. Come on, we're going home." Yeah, I like the sound of that. You're a fucking idiot. Okay. Of course, the broken pieces of my magic armor were still lying in the forest, and Eris was a sword king who'd put up a solid fight against Orsted himself at melee range. I couldn't see how I was going to beat her unless we started off half a mile away from each other. But hey, whatever. I was fine with losing too. Rudius. Just as I had reached that conclusion, though, Ghislaine called to me. Yes? I hadn't seen the woman in a while, but she hadn't changed that much apart from getting a little further into middle age. We'd exchanged pleasantries and had a few conversations since her arrival in the city, but she hadn't gone into much detail about the situation with Eris. That wasn't so strange, since we'd never been that intimate with each other. Miss Eris hasn't changed much at all. You need to show her how you feel. Her voice was calm but firm, just as I remembered, and the implication of her words made me hesitate. Was fighting Eris here really the right move? I glanced over in her direction. She'd assumed her usual cross-armed stance, and as she waited for me to make my preparations. But as familiar as that pose itself was, Eris herself looked very different now. She'd grown taller, her figure had developed, and she had the bearing of a sleek but deadly predator. 5 years had passed. I'd changed in that time, of course, but Ghislaine seemed to think that Eris hadn't. Well then, how had I dealt with Eris back when I knew her? How had I responded to her temper tantrums? How should I respond to this one? Ready? Begin! Ghislaine shouted for the duel to commence, but I didn't raise my staff. Eris, too, just stood there with her arms folded. After a little while, she drew her sword at her waist and began to walk slowly in my direction, letting the blade dangle loosely at her side. It was the same beautiful silvery weapon she'd used against Orsted. Apparently, it was one of the famous 7 sword god blades, and Galfalion himself had given it to her. Eris came to a halt a few paces away and fixed her intense glare on me. She raised her sword in front of me as she came to a halt. What? Aren't you going to fight? You're going to leave if I win, right? Well, I'd rather lose then. Eris frowned and said nothing. I mean, I sort of missed my chance to say this earlier, but I do love you, Eris. Her reaction to this remark made me think of a bristling cat. Ah, crap. Did I piss her off again? Maybe I should have taken this seriously after all. Before I had much time to second-guess myself, Eris sharply swung her sword blade downwards. I flinched reflexively and closed my eyes, only to feel a small jolt at the top of my head. Eris had just tapped me with the hilt of her sword. That was all, and when I opened my eyes again, her face was only inches away from mine. I can't cook like Sylphie does. Yeah, I know. I'm not smart like Roxy. I know. I'm not cute like they are. You're a beautiful badass, so that doesn't really matter. But you prefer, more petite girls, right? Okay, that's not true at all. I'm very attracted to you. Eris returned her sword to its sheath. Slowly, nervously, she wrapped her arms around my waist, pressing her breast against me. And then, all of a sudden, she was squeezing me very tightly. The mildly sweaty smell of her body hadn't changed a bit. I slipped my arms around her in return. Her muscles were more developed than before, but they weren't exactly bulky either. Hugging her felt good. It felt right. You're okay with calling this my win, then? Yeah. You know, Rudy, if you really don't want me, I'll give up on you. Eris' voice was trembling as she spoke those words. Somehow I got the feeling she might have lost on purpose if I'd fought her for real. That won't be necessary. You'll make me part of your family, then? Yeah. As long as you're okay with sharing me with Roxy and Sylphie sometimes. I paused to take a break. The words might sound cheap coming from me, but I needed to say them anyway. I want to marry you, Eris. Her eyes widened, her eyelashes trembled, and her mouth fell open just a little. But then she caught herself, reined in her expression, and tossed her head haughtily to the side. Well, if you insist, I guess I'll let you. And then we get this cute little moment. All right. And with that, Eris Greyrat became my wife. At the dinner table that night, I officially announced that Eris had agreed to marry me. Unlike what happened with Roxy, I'd laid the groundwork in advance this time, so there were no explosions of rage to deal with. In fact, nobody even complained. I'd expected a snarky comment or two from Norn, if not open opposition, but she accepted the news quietly. Maybe she'd given up all hope of returning me to the straight and narrow path. For their part, Roxy and Sylphie both offered their congratulations. Welcome to the family, Eris. Don't worry, we can work out the ground rules a little later. Looking about as awkward as I'd ever seen her, Eris managed to stammer out the words, "Thank you very much for having me," in reply. Somehow that didn't seem like the right phrase to use in this situation, but whatever. It was rare for Eris to get so nervous about anything, but I could tell that she genuinely wanted to win their approval. That seemed like a positive sign. I was really hoping the three of them would learn to get along and avoid any ugly fights, but I didn't have any right to express that thought out loud. After dinner, the three of them decided to take a bath together. Sylphie and Roxy would be giving Eris a lecture on the proper way to use our facilities, after which they'd have a little private bonding time in the tub. I was dying to tag along and help them wash off with my bare hands, but this time I managed to restrain myself from asking. My three wives exited the room, leaving me, Lilia, Zenith, my little sisters, and Ghislaine Didoldia. The moment Eris walked out of the room, Zenith began silently punching me on the head. Lilia murmured, "Miss, I think you've made your point." But there was no sign of the onslaught stopping even after some time. Zenith was a devout member of the Millis Church. She tolerated me taking a second wife, but she seemed extremely displeased with me adding a third. Ow! Ow! That hurts, Mom! Oh, I'm sorry, okay? I won't do it again! Once I expressed my remorse, though, Zenith pulled back her fists and returned to her chair. My little sisters, who happened to be seated right next to her, were now looking at me reproachfully. "Isn't that what you said when you brought Roxy home, brother dear?" Aisha said. "Your word clearly isn't worth that much. I expect you'll be dragging another girl back with you soon enough. Oh, there's going to be so much laundry to do." There was nothing much I could say to that. This decision had clearly lost me quite a few affection points with my sisters. Hmm. Oh well, I guess I can live with that. Aisha did have some legitimate complaints, but her voice was totally flat. She was probably just giving me a hard time for the most part. Rodius? At this point, however, my other sister spoke up, and her voice seemed very earnest. Whatever she was going to say, I needed to take it seriously. Yes, Norn, what can I do for you? As a member of the Millis Church, I can't really approve of your behavior. Understandable. That said, I can tell how much Miss Eris loves you, so I'm not going to object this time. You might not be that fond of her yet, but I expect you to give her plenty of affection anyway. That's all I had to say. I understand. I promise to do my very best in that regard. Norn seemed to like Eris quite a bit, actually. From what I heard, she'd been the one to ask her for those sword lessons. I felt like Norn had gotten a lot more outgoing in general over the last few years. Maybe that had something to do with her work on the student council? Either way, it was definitely a good thing. Master Rudius? Apparently Lilia wanted to say her piece now. Her voice was a little quieter than usual. Yes, Lilia? Now that you've added Miss Eris to the family, this house will be getting somewhat cramped. I'm willing to rent a room nearby and live there with Miss Zenith in order to— Nope, not happening. I interrupted quickly. Look, I want to take care of you two. Well, you're still the one looking after me, really, but you know what I mean. I can't say that I agree with that assessment, Master Rudius, but I'll respect your wishes in the matter. If I went and kicked out my own mothers out of my home because I'd acquired too many wives, my old man would probably turn into some sort of vengeful spirit. A good kid takes care of his parents when they're older. Indeed, we'd run out of guest rooms now that Eris had joined the family, but that wasn't a major problem. We could figure something out if we needed to. Rudius? Finally, it was Ghislaine's turn to address me. Yes, Miss Ghislaine? Just Ghislaine, kid. I studied the fearsome sword woman for a moment. She had to be around 40 by now, but her body was still muscular. It was clear she hadn't been neglecting her training. I can leave the little miss in your hands now, right? Yes, I'll take good care of her, I swear. Oh, yeah? Ghislaine paused, then smiled a little. You've done some growing up, I see. You've got the same look Paul had in his eyes when he decided to marry Zenith. Was that supposed to be a compliment? Well, I'd have to take it as one. So I took after my father these days, huh? How nice to hear. Maybe I had grown a little bit more mature. Hold on a second. Ghislaine only knew Paul in the old days, right? Back when he was a total scumbag? Could I really take that as a compliment? What are you planning to do next, Ghislaine? Any thought of settling down in the city? Nah. Now that I've entrusted Miss Eris to you, my job here is done. I think I'll head back to Osira. Osira? Were you planning to help out with the rebuilding in the Fatoa region or something? Ghislaine's eyes flashed with emotion. Not exactly. I'm going to find whoever got Lord Soros executed, and then I'm going to kill them. It felt like the temperature in the room had just dropped significantly. I hadn't been expecting such an ominous answer, but I could understand where she was coming from. Until now, Ghislaine had been focused solely on taking care of Eris. Now that the little miss was safely deposited with me, her job was complete. The only thing she had left to do was take revenge on those who had brought down the man she'd served so loyally. That means you don't know who they are yet, right? It sounds like his death was one part of a complicated web of intrigue, so I'm guessing lots of people had a hand in it. I'll just cut down all of the Boreas family's old enemies one by one. Simple enough. That struck me as a little too simple. Classic Ghislaine. How was I going to stop her, though? At this rate, she was going to charge into the capital of the kingdom by herself and end up getting killed. Unfortunately, I felt like nothing I said was going to change her mind. This was Ghislaine we were talking about. After all, in that case, maybe the best thing I could do was help her find a better way to do this. I suddenly found myself remembering something from that diary. When Ariel launched that coup d'etat in Asura, it was the water god and North Emperor that had defeated her. Ghislaine, there's something you should know. I've heard from a pretty reliable source that the kingdom of Asura currently has both the water god and a North Emperor working for them. Ah, those two. Are you already acquainted? Yeah, I know them well. So does Miss Eris, for that matter. What about it? Well, you might end up having to face off against them. I know how strong you are, but I don't think you'd come out of that alive. True enough, I couldn't handle both of them alone. With a small nod, Ghislaine looked me in the eyes and fell silent. She was waiting to hear what else I had to say about this. For what it's worth, I know one person who got caught up in the same mess that cost Lord Soros his life. It's possible she was working against the Boreas family at the time, so you might consider her an enemy. But if you join forces with her, I think you'll get a chance to kill the people you want dead, and a legitimate justification for doing so. Who is it? Ariel Anamoy Asura. Ghislaine's ears twitched. It sent a little jolt of nostalgia through my system. Back when I was tutoring her, she always did that when she saw a problem that she couldn't figure out. In any case, if she didn't recognize the name, so much the better. She's the second princess of the kingdom of Asura. Is that so? I paused for just a moment to ask myself if this was really a good idea. Ariel was likely to start a reckless coup attempt in Asura in the near future. Was I just sending Ghislaine to her death? No, the future can absolutely change. For one thing, I'd read that diary. I could offer Ariel at least a little general advice. We could turn that reckless coup attempt into one that would succeed. It was very possible the man god was going to be pulling the strings behind those events, and since I was Orsted's subordinate now, my involvement might change things somewhat. Assuming I ended up finding some way that Ariel might emerge triumphant, it would be better for all of us to have a swordswoman like Ghislaine on her side. I had every intention of helping out personally, but I need to consult with Orsted first. I think you should at least have a conversation with her and see what you think. All right. If you say so, I will. Ghislaine accepted my advice readily enough. For the time being, at least, it seemed like I'd convinced her not to do anything too rash. Whoa! I glanced across the table and found Norn and Aisha staring at me with their eyes wide open. Can I help you guys? Oh, it's nothing. You really were the tutor of a Sword King, huh? What, did you think I made that up? I mean, not really. I just didn't expect Miss Ghislaine to take your advice so seriously. Puzzled, Ghislaine and I exchanged glances. Had there been anything that strange about our conversation? Rudius? Norn interjected. I know this older student at the university who wants to be an adventurer, and they were just telling me the other day about how this really scary Sword King had come to town. Even the toughest people in the city are a little intimidated by her, you know? It's kind of impressive to see her talking to you as an equal. Yeah, a little bit. Ghislaine grinned at that. Oh, sorry. Damn, trying to fix that. There we go. All right. Ghislaine grinned at that. Rudius is a hell of a lot scarier than I'll ever be. Okay. Rudius is a hell of a lot scarier than I'll ever be, kid. I mean, he won the respect of the dragon god. Wow. Norn looked genuinely impressed by this. Maybe I'd regained a few of those affection points. Or maybe those were just respect points. I couldn't see her opinion of my love life ever improving much. Anyway, Ghislaine's praise had won me back a little dignity, if nothing else. Lucky me. Hang on a second, guys. My foot fell asleep. Whew. I was sitting on it for too long. Okay, I got 10 more pages. That night, after Ghislaine went back to her inn, Eris joined Sylphie and Roxy for a private conference of some kind. I was extremely curious as to what they were discussing, but presumably I wasn't invited for a reason. I managed to contain the urge to listen in. At a glance, the moon seemed friendly enough, and Eris was listening to the other two intently. So there probably wasn't anything to worry about. The girl had come a long way from her wilder childhood years, after all. I ended up tutoring Norn for a bit in my study, and once she turned in for the night, I added an entry to my diary. This was definitely a day worth commemorating. When my thoughts turned to our future as a family and my new role under Orsted, I did feel a little anxious, but we'd made it through a big, turbulent storm together. That was something worth celebrating. By the time I stepped out of my study, the house was completely silent. The conference must have wrapped up some time ago. Maybe the three of them were sleeping in the same room tonight. Or waiting for me in my bedroom, for that matter. Okay, not likely. In any case, when the place was this silent, it could be kind of unsettling. Come to think of it, my future self's visit had occurred on a quiet night just like this. Was I in for another dramatic surprise? Maybe some creepy little guy with his whole body hidden by a blurry mess of pixels was going to pop out of the shadows at me. Come on, now you're just being ridiculous. I'd made it to my bedroom now. There was no light coming from within, so it seemed I'd be on my own tonight. Just as I was reaching for the knob, the door swung open from the inside, and I was dragged violently into the room. Gah! I reflexively threw out a hand at my assailant and began to channel mana through it, but they grabbed my wrist and pressed it back against the door, pinning me in place. For a split second, I thought I was done for, but then I noticed who I was up against. Oh, it's just you, Eris. My newest wife, having changed into a casual nightgown, had apparently decided to ambush me. Rudius? For some reason, her eyes were extremely bloodshot. Also, her face was flushed, and she was breathing roughly. She looked absolutely furious. Had I already done something to piss her off? I needed to choose my words carefully. We're man and wife now, right? Officially? Well, yeah. Oh, did you want to have a formal ceremony, maybe? We could call a bunch of people and, no, I don't even remember how to dance anymore. Look, that's not what I'm talking about. I want to do it. Do what exactly? Before I could give the matter much thought, Eris threw her arm around my shoulders and pulled me in for a violent kiss. Her teeth knocked against mine hard enough to send a jolt of pain through my jaw. I tried to pull back, but the door behind me made that impossible. Eris kept on grinding her forehead against mine enthusiastically. As I finally came up for air, Eris moved her arm down to my waist and started basically dragging me across the floor. Within seconds, she'd brought me over to the bed. Wait, what the heck is even going on here? Holy crap! You're moving way too fast, miss! Eris, I think we should slow down a little, you know? We have to talk things through with Sylphie and Roxy first. I did that already. Sylphie said tonight can be my turn. What about Roxy? She might want us to wait while she's pregnant. She was fine with it, actually. At some point during this exchange, Eris had thrown me onto the bed. She was holding me down on it. With so much force that I couldn't have squirmed free if I'd tried. Hey, I want the first kid to be a boy, okay? The woman was still breathing roughly through her nose. She wasn't angry, she was horny. I had to admit, I hadn't expected quite this level of enthusiasm from her. I mean, definitely wasn't complaining. It was charming to see how much she wanted me, and my body wasn't exactly objecting to her advances either, if you know what I mean. But, wasn't I supposed to be the one doing the ravishing? I love you, Rudius. You wouldn't turn me down, right? Well, of course not. Try to calm down a little, though. Why don't we take some time to set the mood first? We can have a few drinks, catch up on the last 5 years, and get started once things are feeling nice and romantic. Ah, screw that. Do you know how long I've been waiting to do this again? Even as she spoke those words, Eris was climbing onto the bed and positioning herself on top of me. Her powerful legs clamped mine in place, and her hands pressed mine against the bed. She leaned in, pushed her nose against my upper chest, and started sniffing loudly. What is she, a dog? I hope I'm not too smelly tonight. Rudius, we're married now, right? That means you're mine, right? Huh? I mean, not exactly. I was hoping you could share me with the other two, actually. Let's all just get along. But it's my turn tonight, so you're mine right now. It seemed there was only one reply she'd be satisfied with. Yes. Eris' grip on my wrist grew noticeably stronger. Ow! Ow! You're tearing my hands off, girl! At this rate, I'm going to have to ask Orsted for another favor. That means I can do anything I want, right? What was she planning to do exactly? Whatever would become of me? Well, it was clearly going to involve sex, so was I opposed to that? Nope. So my answer had to be, sure, I guess. As soon as I spoke those words, Eris turned into a beast. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of sparrows chirping. The first thing I did was look around for Eris, but it didn't take long. That striking face was right there next to me. The woman looked beautiful in her sleep. Whew. With a small sigh of relief, I thought back on the events of the previous night. Eris and I had enjoyed ourselves to great length, especially Eris. I think it's safe to say my technique was superior to hers. I was in the lead early, at least. I didn't want to let her get the best of me, so I gave it everything I had. Sadly, things turned around in the middle game. The woman just had more stamina than me, and much like our very first time, she just kept going. Well, long story short, I didn't get the win. Eris ended up enjoying herself for quite a while as I lay there limp and unresisting. I'd never been so thoroughly dominated in my life. We're talking one of those, I'm sorry, dear, but I belong to Master now scenarios. I'd lost my innocence for good. But despite my defeat, looking at Eris sleeping next to me with that content expression on her face was filling me with warm and tender feelings. She'd been like a raging wolf last night, but now she looked borderline angelic. It put a real smirk on my face. Maybe this was how Sylphie felt when she watched me sleeping. This sure feels different, though. Incidentally, my head was currently resting on Eris's arm. Up till now, I'd never been on the receiving end of this maneuver, so it felt weirdly refreshing. My pillow was a little on the slender side, but it was also very solid for some reason. It made me feel like I was totally safe. Come to think of it, 5 years had passed since we'd seen each other. Eris had done a lot of growing in that time, but I still wasn't completely clear on how muscular she'd gotten. The room had been too dark for me to get a great look last night, although everything I could make out was very enticing. Squirming around a little, I reached out to touch Eris's belly. Oh, how splendid! On the surface, there wasn't much in the way of clearly defined abs. In fact, she had a decent amount of fat on her, but right underneath that, there was a layer of remarkably dense muscle. When I pushed my fingers against her skin, a compact six-pack revealed itself. My abs weren't bad either, but this was really something else. How was it even possible to have a body like this without getting all bulky? It was a miracle her waist was still so slender. She must have trained all of her obliques and hip muscles in perfect balance with each other. Seriously, though, what was it about muscles on a woman that made them so incredibly sexy? I never wanted to take my hands off these things. However, they weren't my only target at the moment. I slowly moved my hand upward in the direction of the two great mounds clearly visible beneath the blanket. Last night, I'd spent a lot of time with my hands trapped in a vice-like grip, so I hadn't gotten any chances to touch these. But we were married now, right? I basically had permission, right? Whoa. Holy crap, what a solid foundation. Eris had pecs. And they were just as firm and compact as her abs. Really splendid stuff. And on top of those nice, solid plates, We had our dessert. Life's all about finding a balance between the hard things and the soft ones, if you ask me. On that note, time to get a little etchy, sketchy, touchy-feely. Oh, wow. Okay, these things are like melons. Sylphie and Roxy didn't have anything like these puppies. I like theirs just fine, but the bigger kind definitely had their own special charm. And from now on, I got to feel these up whenever I wanted to. I really owed a few kind words of gratitude to God. Thank you, Roxy. Thank you, Sylphie. My great quest was at an end. I had scaled the Eris Mountains, and a new day had dawned for all mankind. Ho, ho, ho! Suddenly, a familiar white-haired old man appeared in my mind's eye. Why, if it isn't the wise old hermit! Long time no see, buddy. Take a look at these fresh, glorious fruits. Truly, the land has blessed us with its plenty. Ho, ho! It seems I have nothing left to teach you, young one. May your road lead you to enlightenment. What? No, come back! Wise old hermit! Come back! I still have a great need of your wisdom! Gah! My one-man show came screeching to a halt as I made eye contact with Eris. She'd woken up at some point and she'd been watching me. Was this the part where I got punched? I mean, I did kind of deserve it after groping her like that. Before I could say anything, Eris' hand whipped over and grabbed my wrist. It looked like she was, in fact, a little upset. Let's talk about this, honey. More chatting, less punching. How about some nice pillow talk? Remember that time when we started doing sit-ups together? Back when we were kids and I couldn't help reaching over to touch your abs? Ah, what a little rascal I was. Eris didn't let go of my hand. Instead, she spun to sit on top of me, tangling her limbs around mine. That wasn't anger burning in her eyes. It was lust. Waking up to find me groping her chest must have set her off again. I mean, understandable, right? I knew I would get fired up if I woke up to find someone playing with my body. I guess I'd assumed women might view that situation a lot less favorably than your average man, but maybe Eris was an exception. Well, all right then. Come at me. This time around, I'll teach you a lesson you'll never forget. Wait, gently! Gently! Could you slow down a little, honey? We just spent all night. Eek! As I squeaked like a bashful schoolgirl, Eris began to ravish me for the second time. When I finally got up for good that afternoon, I was alone in the room and Eris was nowhere to be seen. Her side of the bed was already cold. I didn't feel anxious or abandoned, though, just drained and content. I slapped at my quivering waist, rose to my feet, and walked over to the window. The sun was looking particularly yellow today. My face was probably a little yellow, too. I spotted Eris out in the yard. She was doing her usual practice swings with a big, happy smirk on her face. After all that exercise she'd put us through, I was amazed she still had the energy. That woman truly had the stamina of a horse. I mean, I sure wasn't complaining, mind you. Sylphie and Roxy didn't have as much staying power as me, so they tended to get worn out fast. This was the first time I'd really gotten squeezed dry like that. If Sylphie's style was a bit submissive and Roxy was more of a technician, then Eris was the all-out aggressive type, sort of like Tokugawa, Toyotomi, and Oda, respectively. What did that make me, the secret power behind the throne? Indeed. It was only thanks to me getting beaten down by Orsted that Eris became a mighty sword king. Just kidding. If I got too full of myself, I might end up decapitated one of these days. Wouldn't want to make my sweet little Hideyoshi seek vengeance on my behalf. Anyway, I really did want to have a little pillow talk the next time around. I'd honestly been looking forward to just spending a nice lazy hour in bed with Eris this morning. I wanted to hear more about how she'd spent the last 5 years of her life and the people she'd met along the way. For the time being, I headed to the bath to clean myself off. Once that was done, I made my way into the basement and said a prayer to my altar. It felt like it was time to add a third idol to this little shrine. The god of wisdom, the god of love, had just been joined by the god of war. Maybe a wooden sword would be appropriate. I pondered the matter and wandered back up to the living room, where Aisha was busy cleaning the floor. She popped right up at the sight of me. Good morning, brother dear. You've got a letter. It doesn't say who it's from, but there's some kind of symbol on the envelope. Do you recognize it? When I took the letter from Aisha, I froze up on the spot. It was very familiar. With the crest on that envelope, it was the emblem of the dragon god. Oh, I was very familiar with the crest on that envelope. It was the crest of the dragon god. And there we go, chapter 11. I'm going to pee real quick. Let me know what your thoughts were, and I'm going to read them shortly after this. Yeah, I feel a bit better. All that water running through my system. Okay, so there we go. Lurk. Oh, hey. Hey, Drew. Love how you read the word pressed and then had to readjust your pants. That's not even remotely what happened, but okay. Rudy having dignity. That's a weird thought. Time for more bone crunching. Just, ow. My shattered teeth. Yeah, that kiss. Holy crap, man. This is more tame compared to the web novel version. Well, kind of glad to hear that. He mentioned in the web novel that Eris shattered his arm and he had to call Sylphie to heal him. Jesus. Please tell me Orsted cuts off his junk. No. Does anyone else need to see a slap in the future? Nah, Rudius remains horny for the whole story. But Eris is canonically much hornier than Rudius. Yeah, she's way hornier than him. Can't remember, are the walls and the doors in that household soundproof? No. I should Norn heard everything, right? Yeah. Okay, here's the thing. They've been hearing everything for a while, and they just heard Eris dominate him. That's got to be cathartic on some level, guys. That has got to be very cathartic. Eris likes bone crunching. Death by snoo snoo. Death by snoo snoo, indeed. With that thought, the House of Fun by the Madness is now playing through your head. Ah, correction, she doesn't on accident. Yeah. All right, so 80% of the way through, 262 out of 329. If I remember right, let's see. Yeah, we've got an extra chapter as well as these two. So we've got chapter 12, the summons, chapter 13, explanations, and then we have an extra chapter. And that is the end. All right, so we've got about an hour. I think we'll make it. All right. Nanahoshi got upset at how loud they were. Yeah. I'm like, bro, here's the thing. His sisters can complain all day long, but Rudius grew up hearing his parents smash nightly. Like, he's definitely Paul's kid. Just saying. All right. Chapter 12, The Summons. Dear Rudius Greyrat, I hope this letter finds you recuperated and your mana regenerated. I want to discuss our next steps. I will be waiting for you in your cabin on the outskirts of Sharia. Due to certain circumstances, it would be preferable for you to come alone. Orsted. After reading this brief letter, I asked Aisha to make me breakfast right away. I ate a good solid meal, then returned to my room to get dressed. I tried to pick my very nicest clothes, double-checking with Aisha several times to make sure I looked okay. And then, with Aquahartia in one hand and my diary from the future in the other, I walked out of the house. Zenith happened to be out in the yard playing with our pet, Tria and Bite, so I called out, "I'll be back soon, Mother." As I left, she vaguely waved her hand at me in response. It almost looked like a see you later gesture. At her side, Bite wiggled his branches as well. I hadn't said a word to Sylphie or the others. I knew they'd want to come along, but the letter told me to come alone, so that was exactly what I was going to do. It's not like I was going off to battle this time anyway. I couldn't say that I completely trusted Orsted, not yet anyway. But his letter had shown some concern for my well-being, and its tone wasn't unfriendly. Also, Nanahoshi seemed to think he was a decent guy, since she'd... Oh, hold on. There we go. Opposed my plan to fight him on an emotional level. At the very least, he seemed more trustworthy than the man god. That was definitely what I wanted to believe. Oh, damn. I'm still kind of nervous, though, I muttered to myself as I made my way down a quiet street in Sharia. Every time I passed a puddle of water in the road, I couldn't help but stop to examine my reflection and make sure I looked all right. I'd decided to work for Orsted, in other words. He was my new boss. And when the boss called you in for a meeting, you wanted to look your best. Wonder if I should have put on some cologne or something. I had taken a bath this morning, but after the night I'd spent with Eris, it was very possible there were some unfortunate smells lingering on my body. What exactly was the boss going to think if I came into his office stinking of sex? I couldn't imagine he would fire me on the spot, but it might leave a bad impression. That was the last thing I wanted right now. Orsted was the only person who stood a chance to find and defeat the man god, and supposedly he was going to make it happen someday. With the help of my descendants. Sucks to be the man god, but he was the one who'd betrayed my confidence first, so whatever. I wasn't about to sympathize with a guy who'd tried to kill Roxy and Sylphie to protect himself. I was Orsted's pet dog now. I'd wag my tail for him and bare my fangs at his enemies. That was the only way I could protect my family. All right. Having reconfirmed my resolve, I headed for the outskirts of the city with quicker, more confident steps, while carefully avoiding the muddy water splashing by passing carriages. I arrived at my cabin outside the city walls to find it different somehow. It's hard to explain in words, but there was something strange about the air around it. If this were a manga, the cabin would definitely have a menacing aura scribbled around it. It was obvious from a glance that Orsted was already waiting for me inside. I took a few deep breaths and knocked sharply at the door. "It's Rudius Greyrat, sir. I'm here as requested." Ah, that didn't take long. Even though I'd known he was in there, I trembled a little at the sound of his voice. There was definitely a part of me that was still terrified of him. "Do I have your leave to enter?" "Why are you asking me for permission? Aren't you the owner of this cabin?" "Yes, sir. Coming in, sir." When I opened the door and stepped into the cabin, I found Orsted seated in one of the chairs within, glaring sharply at me. Well, maybe he wasn't glaring. His face was just scary-looking by default. I pulled the door shut behind me and walked over as crisply as I could, stopped directly beside the chair across from Orsted and stood at attention. He glared up at me with a slightly suspicious expression on his face. I have expected you to come here with all your friends in tow, but I see there's only 2 of you." "Yes, sir, I came up—" "Wait, 2 of us?" I was a little thrown off by that one. Unless Orsted's eyes were getting so bad that he was seeing double, the comment didn't seem to make much sense. "Eris Greyrat!" Orsted shouted. "You may enter as well." An instant later, the door to the cabin swung loudly open. Eris was standing just outside. Her sword was already dangling from her hand, and there was murder in her eyes. Orsted! She cried, swinging her blade up to point at him. If you lay a finger on Rudius, I'll cut you down on the spot. The force and fury of her voice would have made a lesser man pee his pants, but Orsted was totally unfazed. I have no intention of harming him. Well, I don't trust you. I suppose you wouldn't. Without another word, Eris stalked over to a corner of the cabin and folded her arms menacingly. Still a little stunned by this dramatic entrance, I looked from Orsted to Eris and back again. Should I be making excuses right now, explaining that I hadn't brought her here with me? Insisting that I didn't view him as an enemy? The problem was I couldn't make excuses for the sword she was holding. What was I supposed to do here? As I hesitated, Orsted spoke up. What's the matter, Rudius Greyrat? Have a seat. We need to talk. Right. Pardon me. I sat down, of course, but my mind was still on Eris and her unsheathed weapon. About Eris, your reaction made it clear enough. She followed you here without your knowledge, I imagine. Well, yeah, I guess she did. Would you, mind if I had a word with her before we got started? Feel free. At least it seemed like he wasn't too upset. Turning around in my chair, I quickly beckoned Eris over with my hand. What is it, Rudius? Eris, why did you follow me? I saw you all dressed up. I just wanted to know where you were going. All dressed up. Well, I had picked out my best clothes and fidgeted with my hair for a while. Maybe she thought I was going out on a secret date or something. You understand that I'm working for Orsted now, right? Yeah, but it's Orsted, Rudius. He's obviously planning something, right? I'm worried he might be tricking you somehow. That's possible, but it's too early to say for sure. For now, do you think you can keep calm and just let us talk? We can fight him together if I figure out he's tricking me. I'm counting on you, Eris. Oh, yeah, got it. Apparently satisfied by this, Eris sheathed her sword and took a seat next to me. It was a good thing her mind worked in such simple ways. I'm sorry about that. It's all right. It seems that Eris has a very hard time trusting you, Sir Orsted, but I suppose that's just the curse at work. Orsted's eyes seemed to flash at that. Who told you about my curse in the first place? The man-god. He claimed you suffer from a number of them, actually. I answered honestly and without hesitation. I'd prepared myself to tell Orsted everything about my conversations with his enemy. I see. Orsted raised a hand to his chin and turned his gaze upward for a moment. The ceiling of my cabin wasn't much to look at, so it seemed like he was just thinking things over. First things first, allow me to fulfill my promise to you. Huh? Why do you look so surprised? Not like your former master. I keep my word. That's nice to hear, but I'm just wondering what he's talking about. Did he promise me something at some point? I'm speaking of my method to protect your family from the man-god. Oh, of course. How did I forget about that? I guess I hadn't thought of that whole agreement as a promise exactly. It felt more like a contract, the kind you use to sell your soul to the devil. But then again, the provisions of a contract are basically just a bunch of promises, right? Sure. Are you sure? I haven't actually done anything on your behalf yet. Yes, but I imagine you wouldn't be able to focus on any task if you're constantly worrying about your family's safety. Well, yes, that's true enough. Huh. He was actually being kind of considerate here, wasn't he? I hadn't expected such friendly treatment right off the bat, but to be honest, I was expecting him to order me around sternly. The man had a scary face, but he seemed like a surprisingly good boss. I couldn't understand why Eris was still glaring at him so fiercely. In any case, what specific method did you have in mind to protect them? It's nothing too complex. You need only summon a guardian beast with a strong destiny in order to keep them safe. I see. Unfortunately, I don't know how to use summoning magic yet. Very well. I'll draw the magic circle. You can just channel the mana through it. Oh, that works then. Sorry for the bother. A guardian beast with a strong destiny, huh? In other words, we'd have a guard dog protected by the laws of causality. Will that really be enough to keep them safe, though? The man god has no influence over anything but humans. In addition, he can't manipulate many individuals at any given time. As long as we are taking action, he should have his hands full trying to stop us. Given his personality, this should be more than enough to protect your loved ones. Oh, good. Now we were psychoanalyzing the guy? That bit about him not being able to influence many people at the same time was interesting, though. It implied he could control at least a few simultaneously. Had he been meddling in other people's lives while he was messing with me? However, you mustn't let your guard down. The man god is devious and unpredictable. Don't leave everything to the guardian beast. Make sure you're there for them as well. To be honest, those words sounded kind of wrong coming out of Orsted's mouth. He just didn't look like the kind of guy who'd remind you to spend time with your family. Can't judge a book by its cover and all, but seriously. Anyway, since he was willing to prepare this summoning for me, I'd gladly take him up on it. Now it was time to get down to business. There were all sorts of things I wanted to ask Orsted, of course, but I needed to keep up my end of this bargain as well. It couldn't hurt to proactively ask what my orders were. All right then. What is it you'd like me to do for you from now on? Don't you have any other questions for me? Hadn't expected him to push back like that. Sure, I do, lots of them. Why aren't you asking them in that case? Well, I didn't want to pester you too much, I guess. Orsted let out a sigh and shook his head. You are my ally now. In other words, I'm your subordinate, Sir Orsted. I think we should keep the chain of command nice and clear. The man had beaten the living crap out of me, and now he'd thought up ways to protect my family. Even I wasn't shameless enough to pretend that we were equals in this relationship. Very well, if that's what you prefer. But regardless, the two of us will be working together to defeat the man god. It's important that you learn everything you need to know. Okay, but what if I turned out to be the man god's spy or something? For all you know, I could start feeding him information every night. I trust you, Rudius Greyrat, Orsted said, staring me firmly in the eyes. You risked your life for the sake of your family. That has earned my respect. Wow, you're gonna make me blush. I mean, I guess I had been pretty desperate back then, sure, but... And if that was good enough to make him trust me, I certainly wasn't complaining. Might as well take him up on his offer. What did I want to ask him? A few things came to mind immediately. Why was he so obsessed with the man god? What was that Laplace aspect thing he mentioned? Did he know anything about the displacement incident? And could he explain that whole destiny deal a bit more clearly? Those were the big questions for the moment. All right, then, I'll just go down the list one by one, I guess. It seemed best to start off with his feud against the man god, or the nature of their relationship, really. Then again, I probably needed to hear more about Orsted himself before I could get to that. Can you tell me more about yourself, Sir Orsted? You want to hear my story? Yeah, if you don't mind. What has the man god told you about me? It seems he mentioned my curses, at least. It had been 5 years since that particular encounter, so it was a challenge to recall exactly what he said. I concentrated intently, trying to pull the words out of memory. He said you have 4 different curses specifically. Go on. The first curse makes everything living in this world hate or fear you. The second keeps the man god from seeing you. The third prevents you from going all out, and he didn't know what the fourth is. I see, Orsted said with a small nod. Let us begin with the first curse, then. From the day I was born, I have indeed been loathed by everything living in this world. I don't particularly hate you, though. Some such cases do exist, such as yourself and Nanahoshi. Okay, then. So there were exceptions. The fact that Nanahoshi and I had come here from a different world was probably relevant here. Should I take this opportunity to reveal the truth about myself? With Eris next to me, I was a little reluctant to do so, but keeping secrets from Orsted didn't strike me as a wise idea at this point. I wasn't trying to hide this from you or anything, but I was originally from the same world Nanahoshi came from. Maybe that has something to do with it. Is Rudius Greyrat not your true name, then? It's a very long story, but I'm not exactly like Nanahoshi. I just sort of, woke up here in the body of a baby named Rudius Greyrat, I guess. I'm not sure how to explain it, actually. Ah, so you were reincarnated. I blinked in surprise. I had expected that word to come out of I hadn't expected that word to come out of Orsted's mouth so smoothly. Now that I thought about it, though, I feel like I'd seen a few notes in the diary about the dragon folk possessing some means of reincarnation. Something about how they could come back in a new body a couple decades after they died. Maybe it was an ordinary enough concept for them. Most likely, the reason you do not fear me is connected to your status as one reborn. Are there others who don't fear you? Apart from a handful of exceptions, only those descended from the ancient dragon folk. So Perugius, for one, although he seemed terrified of Orsted, actually. Maybe that didn't have anything to do with the curse. Sometimes you have perfectly good reasons to be scared of someone. As for the second curse, which keeps me from the man-god's sight, this is no curse at all, in truth. What is it, then? Orsted paused for a moment to think, then looked me in the eyes once again. A secret art of sorts, created by the first dragon god as a tool to use against the man god. It enables me to see the flow of destiny and ensures that certain laws of this world do not apply to me. The man-god possesses great knowledge of the future, and his eyes see far. But they are blind to those outside the world's jurisdiction. Interesting. I had no idea what he meant by outside the world's jurisdiction, but being totally invisible to the man-god sounded very enticing indeed. Could you explain that part about seeing the flow of destiny? Let's see. Falling silent, Orsted assumed his contemplative pose again. I had to hope that didn't mean he was thinking up a lie on the spot. When I look at someone, I can see the broad outlines of their life story. Well, that's kind of vague. Does that mean you have the power of foresight as well? No, I don't see the future. I see history, as it is ordained by fate. Now he sounded like a philosopher or something. I didn't quite get the difference between this power and actual foresight. For the moment, it seemed easiest to think of it as lower-tier version of the man-god's ability. Could you use this secret art on me as well? That would be unwise. Why do you say that? Pardon me. Why do you say that? I wasn't sure about seeing people's destinies, but it would be very nice to hide myself from the man-god. I wanted to know the actual reason behind his refusal. The art has the side effect of dramatically slowing your mana regeneration rate. How dramatically? You regained your supply of mana completely in 10 days, yes? Under the influence of the art, that would take roughly 1,000 times longer. 1,000 times longer, that would be, 30 years or so? As a result of this, I cannot wield magic freely, and that is the reason I so rarely fight with all my strength. Aha! Basically, his mana regenerated so slowly that he couldn't use it very often. I didn't know how large his mana supply was, but assuming it took years for it to refill, he'd have to be very careful about conserving power. While I cannot use the secret art itself on you, the bracelet I gave you provides a similar effect. I glanced down at the bracelet on my left wrist. Apparently it was a man-god jamming device of sorts. So this doesn't have any side effects? Maybe if we mass-produced it, I would have done so already if it were possible, and removed my curses as well. Right. Kind of a dumb question. I used a considerable amount of mana in my battle against you, Orsted continued.
I will be unable to fight with all my strength for a while.
Huh? Wait, really? But you took me out instantly.
I was forced to resist direct hits from your magic many times, and ultimately to draw the God Blade, said Orsted, his tone of voice distinctly bitter. It cost me a great deal.
From my perspective, he beat me into the dirt without it breaking a sweat. But apparently, I'd put up a better fight than I realized. A solid effort, if I do say so myself.
In any case, my supply of mana is quite low at the moment. Accordingly, I will need you to take action in my stead.
Right, I'll do what I can. So I was working off the cost of the damage I'd done, basically. That seemed fair enough. On another note, Sir Orsted, can I ask why you're fighting against the man god?
Ah, yes, there is that.
Orsted glanced sideways, gazing at nothing, his tone somewhat reluctant. I had noticed a lot of these thoughtful pauses in his conversation. Was the man lying to me after all? I didn't want to think so, especially after hearing that he trusted me, but then again, it would be odd if he trusted me completely at this point. There was a good chance he was feeding me some simple falsehoods for now and reserving his final judgment until I'd proven myself reliable.
The man god caused my father's death.
Oh? Revenge, huh? Definitely a classic motive. It was the same thing that had motivated my future self to try to kill the man god. It would be easy for me to scoff at such desires at the moment, since no one I loved had actually been taken from me yet. But that diary made it very clear that I had wound up living for vengeance in that timeline.
In addition, his destruction was the dearest wish of the ancient dragon folk. All of the dragon gods have existed solely to pursue that goal.
Okay, so there was some cultural sense of duty involved as well. Wait, all of the dragon gods? How many dragon gods have there been?
I am the 100th, it seems. And the 99 who came before me all devoted their lives to bringing down the man god.
Wow, okay.
However, only a dragon god of great strength and pure blood truly stands a chance to succeed in this task.
Orsted's sharp, shining eyes fixed themselves on mine. After a moment, he continued in a calm and steady voice.
It was for that reason that my father, first of all the dragon gods, reincarnated me in the future.
That's chapter 12, bitches. Yeah. Okay, so chapter 13, and then the special chapter, and that's where, we're 277 out of 329, 85% of the way through. So yeah, we've got a full chapter and a second chapter. That's pretty cool. I remember when I first read this, it was so cool. Now, he's not wrong. Orsted is holding back a few things from him that you will find out later. That we'll find out later in more detail and get some clarification on some stuff. But yeah, Orsted's full mana capacity is a little less than Rudius's, and I love finding out the explanation for Rudius's whole thing with his Lapis aspect. That's pretty cool. That explains why he was so nervous when the girls started standing together against him. Okay, yeah. Because, yeah, he was running low. I have a... yes, Saiyan Fang, I do have a thing at 8. It is 6:22. So, we should have more than enough time to finish this up. All right. Chapter 13. Explanations. I needed to take a step back and review all this. First of all, Orsted was a member of the ancient dragon folk race, brought to this era from the distant past by a special method of reincarnation. There were two other unusual things about him. He was cursed, and he was under the influence of a secret art. The curse made everyone in the world despise him. The secret art caused his mana to regenerate very slowly, but hid him from the man god's eyes, and also let him see the future in broad general strokes.
Why had he come here from the past, curse and all? It started when the man god murdered the very first dragon god. All of the many dragon gods who followed lived only to pursue revenge. Destroying the man god was a goal shared by the entire dragonfolk race. As the son of that first dragon god, Orsted had traveled to the future to realize that dream. Does that sound about right? Yes, you certainly grasped all that quickly. How long ago were you reincarnated, by the way? Ah, it was roughly 2,000 years ago, I believe. 2,000 years? He's been living in this body for that long? Wow. Anyway, his story was coherent enough, but something about it felt a little off somehow. Where exactly was that feeling coming from? Maybe the part about him not regenerating mana? Perugius had a summoning spell that could drain mana from his opponents. And I had to assume Orsted could use that too. Wouldn't that solve the problem by itself? Nah, there had to be some reason why it wouldn't work. Maybe you couldn't store that mana permanently inside of you. Oh, inside yourself. Well, how about Orsted's intense hatred for the man god? The fact that the man god killed his father was a solid explanation on paper, but somehow his animosity felt too intense for that to be its only cause. I didn't get the sense that Orsted was so obsessed with his father's memory, really. I get the feeling you have a strong personal hatred for the man god, Orsted. Is there some reason for that you haven't mentioned yet? Who wouldn't despise that vicious piece of filth? Fair enough. Over the course of 2,000 years, the man god had probably done all sorts of horrific things to Orsted. Even if he couldn't talk to Orsted directly, he could still send him messages through others. Maybe Orsted's current condition had something to do with the conflict between his father and the man god too. Anyway, there were a few things I didn't entirely understand, but I probably knew what I needed to about Orsted's background at this point. Whatever it might be, he definitely had something motivating him to fight the man god. That made him the enemy of my enemy. There were plenty of other questions I needed to get around to as well, for example. During our battle earlier, you mentioned that I possess something called a Laplace aspect. Could you explain what that is? How much do you know about Laplace? Well, I know he caused a great war 400 years ago in which humankind was almost defeated. People say he had an immense amount of mana, but was incapable of using battle aura. Although he was very powerful, Lord Perugius eventually sealed him away with the help of 2 companions. Oh, and he betrayed the Spurred. I'd heard a bunch of other rumors about the man, but those felt like the most important points. Is that all? Oh, right. I did hear he's supposedly going to be resurrected soon. Did you know that this resurrection will be accomplished by means of the Dragonfolk's reincarnation technique? No, I think that's news to me. Oh, wait, the man god might have mentioned it, actually. My memory was a little fuzzy on that point. Anyway, the words reincarnation sure was coming up a lot in this conversation. A little later, I'll want to hear everything that creature discussed with you, or tried to make you believe. Sure? For now, however, let's discuss Laplace. I could feel Eris radiating irritation from the seat beside me at the mere mention of that name. I understood why. The two of us were both good friends of Regard's, and Laplace was his mortal enemy. That made Laplace our enemy as well. Still, I needed to make sure I kept my cool here, no matter what Orsted said next. Getting mad was Eris's job, and calming her down was mine. The demon god Laplace, as you may know him, is in fact the pitiful shell of a man once known as the demonic Dragon King. Orsted continued in a matter-of-fact tone. The demonic Dragon King? Indeed, he was once one of the ancient dragon folk. Wait, what? Wasn't he the demon god? That means he has to be a demon, right? The demonic Dragon King Laplace was among the first generation of the 5 dragon generals. Okay, I'd heard of those guys before. They'd once been under the dragon god's command, but ended up betraying him. And supposedly their battle ended with no one left standing. Laplace escaped the destruction of the world of dragons and wandered this one in pursuit of a singular mission. At that time, he was known as the second dragon god. So the guy was a dragon king, a dragon god, and a demon god? That was entirely too many titles. I was starting to get a headache over here. The man worked feverishly to develop some means of destroying the man god. Calling himself the dragon god, he gathered talented followers to him, teaching them all the arts he knew. And over many long years, he developed his techniques still further. All so that I, the strongest of the dragon folk, could inherit his legacy when reborn in the distant future. Wow. The strongest ever? And so modest, too. But in the Second Human-Demon War, Laplace faced the fighting god, an apostle of the man god, and in that battle his soul was split in two. This was another story I'd heard at some point. At the very end of that war, the Golden Knight Aldebaran had supposedly faced off against the great emperor of the demon world. Kishirika later told me it was actually a battle between the dragon god and the fighting god. So if Laplace was the dragon god back then, and Aldebaran guy must have been the fighting god. Wouldn't that mean Laplace was fighting on the side of demonkind? Thus divided, Laplace lost his memories. One half of them became the demon god, who loathed humanity beyond all reason, and the other became the technique god, who sought the strength to destroy gods. Oh, now the demon god was finally making an appearance, along with, the technique god. I seem to remember he was the top-ranked member of the 7 great powers. Huh. Wait, so the technique god is also Laplace? Indeed. That seemed like one hell of a revelation. Was it really okay for Orsted to just tell me about all this? God, this was way too much information all at once. I couldn't even process it all. Orsted was the son of the first dragon god, but Laplace was the second dragon god? Let's see if I can make some sense of this. First of all, the original dragon god sent Orsted to the future to kill the man god. Laplace was one of the 5 dragon generals at this point, but he either stayed loyal to the dragon god or rejoined him after realizing the man god was up to no good. He survived the dragon god's death and the destruction of his world, and fled over to this one. Once he was here, Laplace started wandering around the world, teaching generations of dragon gods his secrets and honing his techniques so that Laplace could pick them up someday in the future. Then the man god set the fighting god on him and put a stop to that. But Laplace got lucky, or maybe used some last-ditch technique to save himself. Although he was split in half and lost his memory, he managed to live on as 2 separate individuals. That was the general idea, right? Probably? I wasn't too confident I got all of the details right. I looked over at Eris, who had a big, irritated frown on her face. I recognized that as her standard, I didn't understand a single word of that expression. It was a bit of relief to know I wasn't the most confused person in the room. Orsted wasn't done talking yet, though. The demon god Laplace, stripped of his draconic essence, retained 2 things: the belief that his purpose was to slay all humans, and his enormous knowledge of the magical arts. And so, he united demonkind in order to eradicate humanity. The technique god Laplace, stripped of his magical powers, instead retained his vast trove of skills, and a vague but powerful compulsion to pass his knowledge on to others. Accordingly, he created the 7 great powers and devoted himself to the refinement of their techniques. The technique god created the 7 great powers. Yeah, I think I'd heard about this before. It did make some sense, since he was number 1 on the list. Wait a second, though. Wasn't the Second Human-Demon War like 5,000 years ago or something? How do you know all this, Sir Orsted? By the time you were reincarnated 2,000 years ago, the Second Human-Demon War had been over for a very long time. Laplace had already lost his memories, right? Who could possibly have told you this story? I discovered Laplace's personal writings in an ancient dragonfolk ruin. Oh, I see. The man must have kept good records before he lost his memory. Too bad neither of his current selves had ever stumbled across them. Now then, shall we return to the matter of your abundant mana supply? Or, I guess, it's actually written supply of mana. Please do. The first dragon god created something known as the reincarnation art. It is a means of sending your soul into the future and taking over the body of another being as a form of rebirth. The way he'd phrased that felt a little disturbing. However, the body and soul are not normally all but indivisible. A foreign soul would be rejected by the body instantly, causing the art to fail. It was for this reason that the first dragon god injected elements of himself into a number of individuals. The children of those people inherited these aspects of him, and were altered very slightly by them. His plan was to produce an ideal vessel for his soul, even if it took hundreds or thousands of years of slow and steady changes. The reincarnation itself occurs when a body perfectly suited to your soul is conceived. You then take the place of the soul that would otherwise have been born, and emerge a newborn infant. A number of the dragon folk have come to this era by means of this very technique. Perugius is among them, although he remembers nothing of his last life, as he left it while still a child. So, reincarnation involves stealing the body of a baby, basically, overriding its soul. I stared down at my hands. I'd been reincarnated myself. Did that mean I'd stolen this life from the real Rudius Greyrat? Are you still listening to me? Huh? Oh, yes, of course. As I looked up, I found that Orsted was studying my face closely. Let us return to the story of Laplace. The demon god had lost his sanity at the moment of his sundering, but it seems he remembered the details of the reincarnation art, or perhaps found some record of it. After Perugius defeated him, but before his body was sealed, he released many aspects of himself into the world, and sent his soul into the future. In the present day, individuals who bear these aspects and share certain traits with him are appearing in increasing numbers. Some possess large supplies of mana and a great proficiency for magic. Others are born with green hair, or even possessing demon eyes. I knew someone who met a lot of those criteria. Green hair, lots of mana, and a knack for magic. That was everything except the demon eye. Does that mean Sylphie has an aspect? Yes, Sylphiette is one of those I was referring to, although her hair seems to have turned white now for some reason. But she's not actually the reincarnation of Laplace, right? Of course not. He could not possibly be reborn as a woman. It was a bit of relief to hear that, but now that I thought about it, there was a likelier candidate than Sylphie to consider. You think I have an aspect too, right? Almost certainly. A body capable of containing that much mana could not have come into existence otherwise. You know, I always thought I increased my mana capacity by training really hard as a kid. That's also true, of course. Your body merely had the potential to hold vast quantities of mana. Had you not practiced magic from a young age, you would have likely ended up with only a little more than an ordinary person, much like Sylphiette. Your enormous mana capacity is the result of your own hard work, and you have every right to take pride in it. Was that a compliment? Maybe I should be puffing out my chest a little. Just to be clear, I'm not the reincarnation of Laplace either, am I? No, it will be decades before he's reborn, I expect. Well, that was good to know, at least. And I was relieved to finally have a clear answer about why I had so much magic to throw around. I felt a little guilty about the fact that I was basically borrowing Laplace's powers, considering my friendship with Richard. But hey, It's all about how you use it, right? To be honest, there was something else that was bothering me more. Orsted watched me in silence for a while, then let out a small sigh. There's no need to feel guilty. I know that you're a reincarnate yourself, but no Rudius Greyrat exists within my memories. Could you elaborate a little? Those who inherit a lapless aspect often possess great magical potential as an infant, and your body is capable of containing a particularly great amount of mana. It would be no surprise if a fragile newborn soul failed to tolerate such a host. So, what does that mean exactly? The child would likely have been stillborn, had you not assumed its body. Oh. Well, okay then, as long as I hadn't murdered the real Rudius, I didn't want to think I'd stolen a life with this much happiness in it, you know? But if the alternative to my arrival was Paul and Zenith mourning their firstborn child, then it was all for the best. It was time to put this depressing line of thought behind me. I was the son of Paul and Zenith, the one and only Rudius Greyrat. With that matter settled, I decided to move on to my next burning question. I've heard that the displacement incident happened as a result of Nanahoshi being summoned. Do you think you could explain it in more detail? There is a great deal about those events I don't yet understand. No such thing ever happened before. Well, I'm a reincarnate, and I was close to the epicenter of the disaster when it took place. I feel like there's some chance I caused it all somehow. What? All of a sudden, Eris reached under the table and grabbed my thigh. When I looked over, I found her staring at me and subtly shaking her head. In an attempt to reassure, I reached behind her and began fondling her butt. Her rear, both soft and muscular, offered an exquisite tacit. Ow, whoa, 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 holy crap, my thigh! No pinchy, no pinchy! I cannot deny the possibility, I admit. You, Nanahoshi, and the displacement incident are all new additions to history. God, I thought she was going to rip an inch of muscle right out of my leg. I glanced at Eris's face. She was glaring at me with an expression that read, "This is a serious conversation, remember?" In big, bold letters. It was nice to see that she'd learned how to read the room a little. In any case, it sounded like Orsted didn't know much about the displacement incident either. Nanahoshi had come up with some weird theories on her own, but there was no need to get into all that right now. In fact, I felt like I'd asked enough questions for one day. My head was about ready to burst with new information as it was. If I kept this conversation going much longer, I wasn't sure I'd even be capable of understanding anything Orsted told me. Better to pick things up where I left off some other time. I don't know how useful it will be, but I have some information from the future that I wanted to show you. You do? Yes, I think so. Take a look at this. I handed the diary from the future over to Orsted. He flipped it open and quickly skimmed through the first few pages, but after a few moments he looked up from it with his brow furrowed. It will take some time for me to read all this. The handwriting is rather poor. Well, that's okay. Was my handwriting that crappy? Nanahoshi had said the exact same thing. Anyway, it wasn't fair to expect great penmanship from a diary, but I'd have to take things nice and slow next time I wrote someone a letter. Oh, right. Before we get into that, can I ask you about something else? What is it? I paused for a moment. Was it a good idea to even bring this up? Orsted had treated me much more nicely than I'd expected so far, but I felt like I was about to push my luck. You see, sir, there's no need for formalities. Well, Orsted, sir, I'm going to be your subordinate from now on, correct? Yes, as long as you accept that role. Right, so, this is very awkward, really, but I glanced over at Eris, then continued. Can we discuss the terms of my employment? Your employment? Right, I've got a family now, as you know, and if possible, well, I'd like to have some time off to spend with them, every now and then at least. Don't get me wrong, I was ready and willing to work my butt off for this guy. That said, sometimes you need a break to remind yourself what you're working for, right? I wanted time to look in on Lucy, tutor my little sisters, enjoy Lilia's cooking, bask in the sun with Zenith, roll around in bed with Sylphie, roll around in bed with Roxy, and roll around in bed with Eris. Was that too much to ask? That may depend on your performance, Rudius Greyrat. Oh, right, sure. Crap, maybe it was. Sorry, Lucy, Daddy's off to work away from home. I'll be back once we've saved the world from the man god, okay? Farewell for now. Make sure to eat all your veggies. However, I'm no Atofi. It was never my intention to tear you away from the family you risked everything to protect. And I don't have any plans of dragging you around with me for years on end. Currently, at least. Wait, really? It's kind of a relief to hear. Whew. From the sound of things, I was going to get some days off after all. Being separated from everyone I loved would have been challenging, to say the least. Keeping them safe was my top priority, but I wanted to be around them, too. Is there anything else you want from me? Orsted's eyes were fixed on me in something that looked like a glare. Could I actually say yes to that question? What if he got angry with me? No, I need to grow a spine. This is my one window of opportunity. Sorry. There we go. We didn't have a contract or anything, so it was crucial to get this stuff worked out up front. Are you okay with me asking for more? I will do my best to meet your needs. Oh, that sounded promising. Would asking for a salary be taking things a bit too far? I mean, it wasn't that unreasonable. If you want someone to do a job responsibly, you pay them for it. By taking your money, they accept responsibility for their work. Anyone who works for free will do so irresponsibly.
Sounds like someone could benefit from some of
Peanut, thank you so much for the follow. Can we get some Nyantas in the chat? Or so I'd read in some manga once upon a time. Naturally, I wanted to be a responsible subordinate to Orsted, and surely taking some cash from him would be the perfect way to demonstrate this. Hang on a second, buddy. There we go. There. Whew. So, since I'm going to be out of the house a lot, my family's going to lose one of its breadwinners. I wasn't bringing home that much to begin with, and, well, I actually ran up quite a few expenses preparing for our battle the other day. We still have some savings for now, but I could see them running out one of these days. I'm not working. If I'm not working, we'll probably have to cut back on our dinner menu a little, and we've got a bunch of growing kids to... You want money, then? Well, sure, if you want to be blunt about it. As I giggled evilly out of sheer embarrassment, Orsted reached into his coat and pulled something out, which he then dropped casually on the table in front of me. It was a dagger. No, a short sword. In a beautifully ornamented sheath. This is one of the 48 magic swords crafted from the bones of the Dragon King Kajakut by the famous demon swordsmith Julian Harisco. Its name is Eminence, and it would sell for 100,000 Osseran gold coins or so. That ought to last you for a while. Whoa! Did he just say 100,000? An Osseran gold coin's worth what? Something like 100,000 yen, right? So that would be 10 billion yen? A guy could live off that kind of money for the rest of his life. Oh, you could probably build yourself a castle. Do you need more? No, of course not. Holy crap. What was this guy going to expect me to do in exchange for something this valuable? Oh, right. He wanted me to fight the man god. I guess this made me a hired gun, but for some reason getting paid this much to do the job made it seem a little scarier. It was kind of a practical issue here, though. How was I going to turn this thing into cash? Who the heck was actually going to spend that much money on a single sword? It seemed like the sort of thing the Osseran royal family might do, but maybe I should go squeeze some wealth out of Ariel's brothers. It's just, well, I think it might be difficult to find someone who can afford to pay a fair price for this sword around here. I see. You have a point. Perhaps these would be preferable then. This time, Orsted took out a small leather bag. When he dropped it carelessly on the table, it clattered like pebbles in a can. I picked it up and peered inside. It was packed full of transparent stones in all sorts of vivid colors. Are these gems? They're magic stones. I picked out a number of small ones with peculiarly vivid colors. Sell them to any magician's guild and you'll walk away with a sizable sum. These were all colored magic stones? Weren't those things really rare? Unlike that legendary sword, this wasn't build a castle territory, but I could probably bankroll a good decade of decadent living with these. I was starting to feel kind of nervous about accepting all this. I couldn't help shooting an uncertain look over in Orsted's direction. Do you need more? He asked calmly. What? You're not done throwing money at me yet? No. Anything more would just be scary at this point. No, this should be fine for now, thank you. I carefully stashed the short sword and the magic stones away. It felt kind of uncomfortable just leaving them in my clothing. Almost like I was carrying explosives or something. Maybe I could ask Eris to take the sword at least. Very well then, Orsted said with a nod. I'm going to get started on this diary. What do you intend to do in the meantime? I could wait for you to finish. I believe it will take me a full day to get through this. Right. Well, I don't know. It's still pretty early. Maybe we should just continue our conversation for now? It seems that you consider this diary important, so I would prefer to read it first. It was hard to say how important it really was at this point, but I felt like it was worth having him take a look through it, at least. Orsted had the ability to see the future, but only in a vague way. By comparing his knowledge with the details in that diary, there was a chance he'd figure out something valuable. All right, then, I guess I'll head back home for now and come by again tomorrow. Very well. Are you planning to spend the night here, incidentally? I am, yes. Okay, no problem. With a respectful nod to Orsted, I stepped out of the cabin and turned toward the city of Sharia. In the warm evening light, I made my way along the road back home, staying just a few paces behind Eris. Thanks to all the complicated stuff I'd discussed today, my head was feeling heavier than usual. The only thing my weary brain was capable of focusing on was the shapely pair of buttocks just in front of me. Eris's butt really was amazing. I'd never seen such a perfect synthesis of muscle and fat. Somehow it was both compact and plump. The girl had curves, all right. This is probably what people meant when they talked about sex appeal. Incidentally, Eris's pants were pretty tight around her butt, which emphasized its shape in a pleasing way. They made it very clear just how much volume she had in there. What exactly would you call those things anyway? Tights? Leggings? It wasn't a style you saw much around here. Was that some kind of leather they were made of? No, they looked too flexible for that. Maybe it was a fabric instead? I felt like touching them would be the quickest way to check. Yes, that seemed like an excellent idea. I might lose consciousness for a while, but that was a small price to pay for solving such a profound mystery. All right, Eris. Can you counter my new technique, the grope of light? Rudius? Eris suddenly turned around, and I hurriedly looked up in order to meet her gaze. You're still Rudius, right? As always, there was a cryptic little frown on her face. From her tone, though, I knew she had to be talking about all that reincarnation business we discussed earlier. Yeah, it sounds like I've got the Laplace aspect thing mixed up inside me somewhere, but still the same person I was yesterday. So nothing's really different now, right? Right. I learned a few things about myself, that's all. I haven't changed a bit. I kept my answer simple and straightforward, with no apologies or excuses. To be honest, I wasn't sure if Eris had been keeping up with my conversation with Orsted. The man seemed to feel like that reincarnation was a perfectly ordinary, everyday phenomenon, and I'd read enough science fiction in my previous life to make sense of his explanations. But without that kind of background knowledge, it might have been almost incomprehensible. Then again, Eris was about 20 years old now. She was past the age where you could get by without doing any thinking for yourself. There was a part of me that wanted her to stay clueless forever, but that was just stupid, selfish dream. Eris nodded at my words, although it was hard to say if she really understood them. Do you want me to keep this a secret from Sylphie and Roxy? If you don't mind, yeah, I'd rather tell them myself when the time's right. In reply, Eris took 3 quick steps forward, then stopped abruptly in her tracks. The setting sun was behind her now, silhouetting her against the evening sky. Her hair shone like rubies as the light played through it. Even in the shadow, her striking facial features and intense gaze were mesmerizing. Damn, she really is beautiful. All right, she said. You have to hold my hand then. Eris held out her hand, and I took it without another word. It was as lovely to look at as the rest of her. It was also calloused and a little on the tough side. Very different from Sylphie's hands or Roxy's. Warm and strong. That hand wrapped itself around mine. I squeezed it firmly back and began to walk. This was the first time in ages that I'd strolled along side by side with Eris. For some reason, it was enough to make me very happy. And when my thoughts turned to the new chapter of my life that would begin tomorrow, my heart throbbed slightly, with excitement. Alrighty. That was chapter 13, guys. Look at that. We only have the extra chapter left, and it's almost 7. Yeah, we're going to keep this going. Hi. Hi. Can I help you? Yeah. I love you. Hi. Yeah. Don't you worry, buddy. 297 out of 329. Jesus Christ, this is a long extra chapter. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 20, 21, 22, 23. 22. Okay, so 323 is actually the actual ending of this. And 297. So I'm 92% of the way through. The extra chapter is, in fact, a full-on chapter. Anytime I see extra chapter, I think, oh, it's just a little small thing. No, it's a full-ass chapter that happens to be a side story. Fuck. So we've got about that much left. You don't need money to construct a castle. You have magic. You're not kidding. You are not kidding. You're reading the diary. Damn, Rudy, you could be a real scumbag. Yeah, no shit. How does anyone keep track of all these gods running? There's a lot of gods. No joke. Some are just achievers. Lapis apparently one of them. Yeah, achievers. Oh, I have time. You have the time wrong. Yeah. Okay. So we're gonna finish this up. Shit. Cutting it kind of close, but I'll do what I can. All right. I think he's eager to go out, which is kind of why I'm trying to balance out the time and everything. But I want to finish this, get done, and move on. Because this will be the end of 15. All right. Extra chapter. A wild blade finds its sheath. Eris' eyes snapped open violently. She'd woken herself up with a somewhat undignified yelp. She sat up in bed and scratched at her unkempt hair, looking around in bleary confusion. She was in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar room. The window and the closet were both new to her as well. However, she recognized the 2 swords leaning against the bed, and the clothes scattered carelessly across the floor. It was clear that she'd gone to sleep here on her own initiative last night. Ah, right. Once she'd processed all this, her memories from the previous night came back to her easily enough. She'd recalled saving Rudius's life and fighting Orsted to protect him. In her years at the Sword Sanctum, she dreamed about battling Orsted on many occasions. On the day she pushed herself to the very limit of her training, and fell asleep the moment her head hit the pillow, it almost always happened. The dreams changed somewhat, and as she grew older and stronger, but they always involved her battling the dragon god alongside Rudius, and she always woke up before the duel was concluded. Yesterday, however, their battle had reached an end, something that had never happened before, and the outcome was nothing like she'd imagined. It had seemed too strange to be real. She assumed it must have been another dream, but judging from where she found herself this morning, I guess that really happened, Eris murmured thoughtfully. The day after the battle with Orsted, she woke in the Grey Rat family's house. Eris Grey Rat was starting to feel uneasy. For many years, her dream had been to fight Orsted alongside Rudius. It was the whole reason she'd traveled to the Sword Sanctum. She had now fulfilled that goal. Things hadn't gone exactly as she'd imagined, but she'd held her own against the dragon god. Of course, she had given some thought to what would come after this. Her plan was to live happily ever after with Rudius. She'd never been too clear on what this would involve exactly, but it was still her intention to make it happen. Yet, despite how she felt about the matter, and the days after arriving at this house, she'd found herself unable to even hold a conversation with Rudius. Eris muttered as she washed her face. I don't get it. This bathroom had a large mirror over the sink, offering her a good view of herself. She studied her face for a moment, unkempt red hair, upturned eyes, and a mouth that seemed to scowl on its own every time she closed it. She managed to wash the dried drool off her cheek, but it hadn't helped matters much. The word cute definitely didn't apply to her. When she considered the meaning of that term, two faces immediately appeared in her mind's eye. Sylphie and Roxy's features differed, but they could both be described as adorable. They didn't have Eris's sharp, upturned eyes or her mane of messy hair, and they didn't look angry when they closed their mouths. Their figures were very different from hers as well. Their bodies weren't that womanly, but Rudius seemed to prefer things that way. Of course, Eris couldn't magically change her appearance overnight, so she'd given up on competing with them on this level. But there were other aspects of this problem to consider, too. Sylphie was the kind of woman who took good care of her family and her household. It wasn't just that she could handle chores or cook a decent meal. She was also thoughtful and considerate to everyone. No matter how stupidly Eris might behave, Sylphie was never going to laugh at her behind her back. And above all else, it was obvious that she loved Rudius very much. Anyone who could recognize how amazing Rudius was earned some bonus points in Eris's books. As for Roxy, well, she was someone even Rudius respected deeply. She had a bit of a clumsy side, but she seemed like a calm and clever person with a wise outlook on life. And on top of that, she had a good job at the university, which made her the biggest earner in the household. Rudius had told Eris all about how wonderful she was on their travels together. As far as Eris was concerned, anyone Rudius respected was someone worthy of respect. Where did that leave Eris herself in comparison? She wasn't much good at housework or cooking. When it came to earning money, working as an adventurer was the only thing she knew how to do. And it was hard to say how well she'd even managed that without Rudius handling all the complicated details. Just to repeat, Eris had every intention of staying with Rudius from now on. The specifics hadn't worked out as she'd expected, but those were all minor details in her mind. Of course, there was a part of her that wanted him all to herself, and she had some mixed feelings about coming on as wife number 3, but she'd accepted all that some time ago. Rudius had gone through a very difficult period because of her, for one thing, and she'd seen plenty of men with multiple wives back in Asura. There was nothing that strange about it to her. That said, now that she'd actually met his other wives, she was starting to feel kind of inadequate. Eris wasn't a kid anymore. She knew that life wasn't simple or easy. She still didn't have a great sense of just how complicated it could get, but she was well aware that you couldn't get through it with nothing but your sword skills. Back in the day, she'd never worried about all that other stuff. In her mind, Rudius could take care of everything.
And that meant she didn't need to bother. But after seeing Sylphie and Roxy at work, she didn't feel that way anymore. The whole reason she'd run off to the Sword Sanctum in the first place was to become Rudius's equal. She wanted to become stronger so that she wouldn't be a burden to him anymore. And she had achieved that goal, to be sure. But now that she was back, it turned out Rudius already had 2 women supporting him. They both had all sorts of valuable life skills, which they actively used to help him in 100 different ways. Maybe she didn't have the qualifications to be his wife after all. Maybe that was the reason he kept shooting her glances with a weird look on his face, instead of bringing up his marriage proposal. It was a distressing thought, one couldn't seem to shake off. Under ordinary circumstances, Eris might have tossed all her worries to the side and charged head-on at Rudius. But these weren't ordinary circumstances, and her feelings of self-doubt had grown so strong that she couldn't bring herself to start the conversation. All right. By nature, however, Eris wasn't capable of brooding at great length, and she wasn't the spoiled young lady she'd once been, who was incapable of taking action on her own. She was a master swordswoman who'd studied in the Sword Sanctum itself, earning the prestigious rank of Sword King. During the course of rising to these heights, Eris had learned exactly what to do when she felt self-doubt. When you lacked the qualifications that you needed, it was just a matter of obtaining them. Hold on a second, guys. I gotta go get some water. And now Toby is either confused or excited. I don't know which. Alrighty. Okay. Bringing a new gallon of water in here, buddy. Hi. Alrighty. I'm sorry, my throat was starting to dry out. After washing up and finishing her daily practice swings, Eris quickly rinsed her sweat off, then headed straight toward the kitchen where Sylphie, Aisha, and Lilia were already bustling around. Only a few days had passed since the battle with Orsted, which had been a stressful and tiring experience for everyone. But with 3 competent cooks in the kitchen working on a fairly small number of dishes, things seemed to be going smoothly enough. Nonetheless, Eris called out, "Let me help too. What should I do first?" "You just wait patiently until the food's ready, Eris," Aisha instantly replied. The implicit message here was, there's nothing for you to help with. Aisha was a cheerful, sweet girl by nature, and she had nothing but fondness and respect for her new big sister. But she was also well aware that Eris couldn't cook to save her life. Also, they had the situation under control as it was. Unfortunately, Eris wasn't much good at reading between the lines either. "I can't just sit around forever. I'm going to be Rudius's wife too." Aisha somehow resisted the urge to sigh in exasperation and looked over at Sylphie, who was smiling awkwardly. Sylphie was the one in charge here, so the final decision rested with her. Do you know how to cook, Eris?" Sylphie asked, her voice gentle. "I can help out at least," Eris replied, puffing out her chest confidently. "Well, okay. Could you cut these vegetables for me, then? We're going to use them as a stew. But they're always a little tough for us to chop." Sylphie handed Eris a kitchen knife and pointed her in the right direction. Eris looked down at the freshly peeled squash-like vegetable before her, brimming with excitement. "I just need to chop these up, right?" "Yeah, they're pretty tough, though. Do you think you can manage?" "Of course. I'm real good with a sword. But that's a kitchen knife." Eris had basically done nothing except practice with the sword for years now. But back in her adventuring days, Richard had taught her how to strip the skin off a dead monster, and she'd also dressed the meat a few times.
Wasn't like she had no experience with all the cooking. In other words, had no experience at all with cooking. Gotcha. Unfortunately, preparations for the Grey Rat family's breakfast didn't involve the dissection of poisonous monsters, but Eris was convinced that she could handle chopping a few vegetables easily enough. Huh? However, the squash proved a lot tougher than Eris had anticipated, and her knife stopped short halfway through it. She was very good at hitting quickly moving objects, but this was her first time facing an immobile object with a cutting board. Maybe it was something you needed to practice. However, Eris was a sword king now. She knew her way around a blade, and she knew how to slice right through things, even if they were a little tough. Eris, you want to cut that at a more of an... Just as Sylphie was about to teach her the trick to this, Eris exhaled sharply, raised the knife too quickly for the eye to follow, and swung it violently back down. Sylphie didn't even see a blur. She just heard the chunk of the blade striking home and saw the squash split in half, along with the cutting board underneath it. The cutting board Rudius had bought her when they got married, and she'd been using ever since. "How do you like that?" Eris said proudly. Sylphie's cheeks twitched slightly, but she managed to control herself. She'd been fond of that cutting board, yes, but it was a practical object, and it would have gotten worn out eventually in any case. They could always buy another one. "Ah! That's the cutting board Rudius bought Sylphie as a wedding present!" Aisha cried out in Sylphie's place. Picking up the two halves of the broken cutting board, she glared at Eris reproachfully. "Eris, you're terrible!" Slowly, anxiously, Eris looked over at Sylphie. The woman's cheeks were still twitching, but somehow she'd managed to keep a smile on her face. "Oh, it's all right. It's not like she did it on purpose, right? Sorry about that." Eris' apology was genuine. If someone had chopped a gift Rudius gave her in half, she knew she would have flipped out on them. "I think we'll have someone else handle cutting the vegetables today, though." For the next few minutes, Sylphie made an effort to find little tasks that Eris could help out with. Unfortunately, she proved much clumsier than expected. When she tried to heat something up, she nearly caused a fire. When she washed a saucepan they were finished with, she somehow bent its handle, and then when she carried food out to the table, she ended up dropping it all over the floor. Normally, she might have handled these tasks just fine, but she was a little too vigorous doing anything today. When you're trying very, very hard, it's easy to make mistakes you wouldn't otherwise. Ultimately, Eris ended up with the assignment of sharpening the kitchen knives that were growing dull. While most of what she'd practiced recently concerned how to use her sword, she'd also learned how to maintain it. Richard had taught her the basics, and she'd had extensive practice in the sword sanctum as well. There were good reasons for this. For practitioners of the sword god style, who sought to cut down their opponents in a single strike, it was crucial to keep their sword razor sharp. A kitchen knife wasn't a sword, obviously, but it was still a blade. There wasn't much difference in how you maintained them, but by the end of that morning, every knife in the Grey Rat family's kitchen looked sharp enough to cut through steel. This accomplishment earned Eris a good amount of praise from Sylphie and the others. Of course, she was fully conscious of the fact that this wasn't quite the kind of housework she'd been hoping to help out with. Eris had screwed up big time in the kitchen. Still, she wasn't about to give up. It seemed like cooking wasn't her thing, but she could find a way to earn her keep at least. With this thought in mind, she set out for the Renoa University of Magic, where Roxy worked as a professor. The plan was to explain the situation and see if Roxy knew of any jobs she might be suited for. You want to know if there's anything you can help out with?" Eris arrived just as Roxy was getting started on her lunch, distracting her from the mystery of why so much of her lunchbox's contents were slightly charred today. "Yeah, everyone says it's a big help to have you bringing home that nice regular salary. I'm going to be Rudius's wife too, so I should really earn some money myself." "Ah, I see. Well, I can certainly do my best to help you find a job in that case." "Thanks, Roxy. First of all, can you tell me what your skills are?" Eris' mind immediately jumped to things Rudius had taught her many years ago. This place was a school, so it seemed like the most relevant knowledge she possessed. I can read and write and do arithmetic. Oh, and I know some basic magic, too. Of course, Eris wasn't especially good at any of those things, but she still delivered her reply with confidence. Roxy fell silent and tried to think through this. Eris was a sword king. Naturally, the best option was to find her a job where that title would be relevant. Although it wasn't clear if she had the ability to teach others her skills, finding her a post as an instructor of swordplay seemed like the ideal option. She didn't have the necessary qualifications to become a formal faculty member yet, but she could be hired as an assistant instructor right away. Fortunately, the University of Magic did offer its students swordplay lessons, and Roxy's recommendation would count for something here. The university's current swordplay instructor was of the advanced rank in his style, which made him Eris's inferior. There was a chance that taking on such a powerful assistant would be too much for his pride to tolerate. But as she considered this, Roxy recalled seeing the man talking excitedly about the arrival of 2 sword kings in Renoa just the other day. He'd even mentioned something about how badly he wanted to meet them, and maybe even learn a thing or two under their instruction. At this very moment, the man seemed to be shooting jealous glances in her direction from the side of the faculty room. Roxy had the feeling he might endorse this idea enthusiastically if she called him over. However, Eris hadn't mentioned her swordsmanship in response to Roxy's question about her skills. Why was that? Roxy was a clever woman. It didn't take long for her to arrive at the answer. Eris was a sword king, a cut above even the sword saints. Only the truly talented and powerful ever earned that title. Among magicians who rose to the equivalent rank, there were many who would only take on specific pupils they deemed promising. In all likelihood, Eris was also unwilling to teach her skills to just anyone. In that case, suggesting she take on a job as an assistant swordplay instructor would be most unwise. She might even take it as an insult. Of course, all this was just Roxy overthinking things, but nonetheless, she opted for a different suggestion. All right, then. How about a job as a security guard? A guard? That sounds kind of dull. Well, most jobs are a bit on the dull side, I'm afraid. Yeah. I guess even adventuring was a little boring sometimes. Okay, then. Within minutes, Roxy's recommendation secured Eris a trial run as a Renoa University of Magic security guard. Once the formalities were taken care of, Roxy led Eris out to the University of Magic's main entrance. Since Eris didn't yet have a good sense of the campus layout, guarding the front gate was the only job she could do at the moment. The idea was for her to work a shift that afternoon, after which she would be officially hired by the university. All right, then. I have a class to teach, so I need to be going now. I'll come by to get you in the evening. With those words, Roxy left Eris in the hands of the veteran guard at the gate and headed back toward the main school building. The guard looked Eris over for a moment, then scratched the back of his head uncertainly. Let's see. Gate duty's pretty simple, honestly. You stop anyone who looks fishy or dangerous, ask them to prove their identity, and kick them out when necessary. That sounds easy. Yep, sure is. It's not like we get that many suspicious characters loitering around, but hey, let me show you how it's done anyway. With that, the guard positioned himself next to the gate and began keeping a watchful eye on everyone who passed through. However, the University of Magic had a wide range of facilities and stores on campus, so it was fairly rare for students or professors to leave the grounds on their lunch break. That meant there wasn't much foot traffic apart from a handful of people who seemed to be maintenance men or vendors bringing in supplies. The guard did call out to one tough-looking customer with a big scar on his cheek, only to discover that he was a bodyguard for some noble student living in the dorms. Just as he'd said, the campus didn't seem to get too many fishy-looking visitors. So that's about it. The foot traffic will slow down even more by the early afternoon. Why don't you have a try for a while? Got it. In high spirits, Eris positioned herself next to the gate, where she assumed her signature pose, arms folded, legs spread wide, and chin in the air. Her gaze was intense. Too intense, in fact. Nobody could seem to look her in the face. Those who passed through the gate did so staring at the ground, in an effort not to meet her eyes. There were no shady customers to be seen. Anyone who was considering some illicit behavior would have thought twice after one good glare from Eris. However, among all the cowering and cringing, there was one man who didn't so much as flinch, indifferent to Eris's presence. He strode onto the campus as if he owned the place. The expression on his face was calm and confident. There was nothing that unusual about his bearing, but given the quivering people around him, he stood out like a sore thumb, and so Eris made a snap decision. There's something strange about that guy. Hold it right there. The man stopped in his tracks and looked over at Eris dubiously. Can I help you? His tone was polite enough, but the look on his face was saying, I'm a busy man. Can we get this over with quickly? Of course, this attitude only made Eris more suspicious. There's something fishy about you. I've been passing through this gate for more than 20 years. This is the first time I've heard that. You seem rather fishy to me yourself. I don't recognize your face. How long have you been working here? I just started today. I see. Well, I suppose I can't blame you then. The man reached into his pocket to retrieve his official university identification badge, but in that moment, an unseasonably strong gust of wind happened to sweep by, and his hand jumped reflexively from his pocket toward his head. Eris reacted instantly to this highly suspicious movement. Stepping forward in the blink of an eye, she seized his wrist firmly in her hand. What are you hiding up there? Gah! Before Eris's very eyes, the wind carried off the man's hair. All of it. At once. All that was left behind was a beautifully shiny dome. Eris froze up. She'd recognized the man was trying to hide something, but she hadn't imagined it was this. With the hand that Eris wasn't grasping, the man reached into his breast pocket once again and pulled out his university badge. My name is George. I'm the principal of the Renoa University of Magic. As he spoke, his face was crimson with both embarrassment and fury. To cut to the chase, Eris was fired on the spot. Well, it wasn't technically a firing, since she hadn't even been hired yet, but the university formally declined to take her on as a security guard. Understandably, this left Eris feeling a little down in the dumps. She was no good at housework, and she couldn't handle working a job either. Her growing sense of her own uselessness had been painfully reinforced by today's events. There we go. It might have felt different if she'd at least managed to stumble through something, she set her mind to, but after 2 straight disasters, her self-confidence was reaching new lows. At the moment, Eris was lying on top of a shed in the corner of the Grey Rat yard and staring up at the sky, much like she used to do back when she was living in the city of Roa. In her mind, she was replaying a conversation with Rudius from many years in the past. What's the point of doing something I'm not even good at? Rudius' reply had been simple enough. The worse you are at something, the more satisfying it feels when you finally get the hang of it. In a sense, housework and employment weren't different from the dancing she'd struggled with back then. She'd get the hang of them eventually, as long as she kept trying despite her failures. At the same time, something felt a little off about that plan. It probably would be satisfying to succeed, but even so, something just felt off. Unfortunately, Eris couldn't seem to figure out why that was. Let go of me! Just then, the wind carried a voice up to her. It was one she recognized. Eris sat up on the shed's roof and turned in the direction the voice had come from. From the sound of things, there was an argument taking place near the front door of the Grey Rat family home. Wonder what's going on. She hopped down from her perch and headed around the house. where she spotted Rudius's sister Norn with a boy about her age. The boy was richly dressed. His uniform had the same design as Norn's, but you could tell at a glance that his was made from fine fabrics and expensive buttons. It wasn't just his clothing that stood out either. He had long, wavy blonde hair, neatly groomed eyebrows, and skin that clearly got a lot of care. The two guards standing at attention behind him made it obvious that he was a noble. At the moment, he was holding Norn's hand, apparently to prevent her from entering the house. "Come now, Norn," the boy said, brushing his free hand through his hair in an obnoxiously showy gesture. "If you simply come along with me, you'll be helping out that dear brother of yours and your beloved Princess Ariel." "What are you talking about? Princess Ariel and Rudius aren't even around right now." "So much the better. If they return to find we've taken helpful measures on their behalf, they'll surely praise us for our foresight and initiative. It will be a valuable step toward winning their confidence. They just get mad at me for acting without their permission, actually." From the looks of things, Norn wanted nothing more than to pull her hand free, but this kid was a noble, and it looked like he had some real influence. She probably didn't want to run the risk of angering him. "Oh, they won't be upset, I assure you. Take a look at these two behind me. They're elite fighters we recruited from one of the best mercenary bands in all of the Northern Territories. Your brother's been spending a lot of time away from the house lately, hasn't he? Allow me to protect it in his stead. It's not necessary. We've got Sophie and Roxy to look after us. Nothing but women, in other words. Zenoba and Cliff come all the time." "But they're not here now, are they?" In the face of the boy's relentless pressure, Norn's protests were growing briefer and less firm. At this rate, there was a good chance he might end up bullying his way into the house. Frowning, Eris strode over. "She's not interested. Take your hands off her." The boy knitted his brow at the sudden interruption. "Pardon me, and who are you supposed to be anyway? Do you not know who I am?" "No." "I'll tell you then. I am Richard Monarius, heir to the honorable house of I couldn't care less. I couldn't care less. Did you not hear me the first time? Take your hands off her." As Eris cut off his attempt to introduce himself, the boy Richard's confident expression took a turn for the sullen. "You're a remarkably rude and ignorant woman. Look here, if I wanted to, I could have this little house of yours torn down in no—" Richard stopped mid-sentence, realizing that his legs felt strangely cold all of a sudden. When he looked down, he found his pants lying around his ankles, leaving his underwear fully exposed. With a little squeak, the boy hurriedly pulled his pants back up, only to discover that his belt had been sliced in half, forcing him to hold them up with his hand. For a moment, he had no idea what just happened to him. Then he heard a small clink from the sword at Eris's waist. He looked up to find her staring at him with cold disdain in her eyes. "Next time, I'll cut that arm off instead." Richard was infamous for his shameless behavior and was sometimes called deficient as a noble. But whatever his moral flaws, he possessed a perfectly functional sense of self-preservation. He knew that Eris wasn't making an idle threat, and instantly released Norn's hands and took a quick step backwards. Fine! I'll be on my way for now, then!" At those words, Eris drew her sword again. Somehow it left its sheath without making a sound. Something about that felt incredibly menacing. "What? I already said I'm leaving for the day." "Don't come back tomorrow either, or the next day." Richard's legs began to tremble at the sheer intensity of Eris's gaze. He couldn't meet her eyes, of course, but he could feel them boring into him. Still, he had his pride as a noble on the line. He couldn't bring himself to just let this crude commoner make an utter fool of him. "Do you dare to threaten?" But just as he opened his mouth to speak, one of his bodyguards grabbed him by the shoulder and pulled him firmly backward. "Sorry, your lordship, but we better get out of here. I'd bet good money that girl's the Berserker Sword King people have been talking about. She's not bluffing about this. You understand? There's no reason There's no reasoning with a woman who trained in the sword sanctum. Normally, these men followed their young master around even on his most idiotic escapades, efficiently cleaning up his messes with a quiet sigh. But it was precisely their skill and competence that allowed them to realize just how dangerous Eris really was. Damn it! I won't forget this! With this limp attempt at a parting shot, Richard started to turn away, but before he could move an inch, Eris called out to him sharply. I won't forget you, either. If you mess with this girl again, I'll kill you. That's a promise, okay? I'm gonna remember your face. Those words were the finishing blow. The knowledge that this terrifying woman was going to be keeping tabs on him left Richard's body quivering with fear. Gah! Terrified into silence at last, the suddenly pale-faced boy spun around and strode quickly away. Eris kept glaring after Richard and his bodyguards until they disappeared completely from view. Only then did she finally relax. Of course, she hadn't meant any of that seriously. Eris could be somewhat violent at times, but she didn't actually go around murdering obnoxious brats. It had only been a bluff. Honestly, she didn't intend to remember the boy's name, much less his face. Remembering things was never her strong suit. Still, the force of her very genuine hostility had been enough to make her words seem plausible. Whew! With a little sigh, Eris turned and headed back inside the house. Norn just watched her go without managing so much as a thank you, but her hands were clasped against her chest, and admiration shone in her eyes. Scaring off that boy had felt pretty good, in all honesty, but Eris was already wondering if she'd just screwed things up again. Norn had looked unhappy about the situation, but their discussion had sounded kind of complicated. Maybe the brat was actually important somehow. It felt like she might be in for another lecture later on. Sure enough, just as she stepped into the house, Sylphie and Roxy stuck their heads out of the living room and beckoned her over. They'd clearly been watching that little scene unfold from a distance. Bracing herself for a talking to, Eris headed over to join them. Thank you, Eris. Well done. And found herself blinking with surprise at their sudden words of gratitude. Huh? We saw that. You helped out Norn, right? That boy didn't listen to a word we had to say, but it looks like he won't be bothering her again. There were big smiles on both their faces, but Eris frowned uncertainly. Are you sure I should have done that? He's got connections, right? Well, his father is contributing to Princess Ariel's cause, and he does have some influence at the university. This was exactly what Eris had been afraid of. Sylphie explained that Richard was the son of a powerful Renoan noble. Not only was this noble one of the Princess Ariel's main financial supporters, he made large donations to the university on a regular basis and had a considerable amount of sway with its administrators. To put things bluntly, a decent percentage of both Sylphie and Roxy's pay was coming from money he provided. Of course, his son Richard had nothing to do with any of these matters. Even if he ran back home and whined to his daddy for hours on end, it was unlikely there would be any consequences for Sylphie or Roxy, let alone Princess Ariel. However, Richard had convinced himself that his father's contributions entitled him to strut around like he owned the place. No matter how many times Sylphie and Roxy told him off, he'd simply ignored them. We were just about to go out and shoo him away when you showed up, Eris, Roxy added, her nose flaring with enthusiasm. I was a little worried for a minute there, but my goodness, that was satisfying to watch. Sylphie chuckled a little, but then turned with a serious expression on her face. Hey, Eris? What is it? Sylphie reached out and took Eris's hands in hers, and then, as Eris hesitated uncertainly, she began to speak. Sometimes I get the feeling you think you're not good enough the way you are. But that's definitely not true, okay? Try to have some confidence. Eris frowned a little. This almost felt like a rejection of her efforts to improve. Where did that come from? Well, you've been worrying yourself sick lately, right? I think I kind of understand how you feel. Whenever I watch Rudy at work, it makes me feel like I have to learn all sorts of new things. And this is This is that moment right there. I think it's really, really cute. And you can also see just how damn tall Eris is compared to the others. All right. Let's see. Okay, we're not far away. It's 2 more pages. Startled by Sylphie's perceptiveness, Eris found herself at a loss for words. But Sylphie wasn't done yet. You know, Eris, we're pretty good at watching Rudy's back, if you know what I mean. We keep an eye on things behind the scenes. You definitely helped us out today, but normally we stay on top of those sorts of problems. Sylphie paused for a moment, and her grip on Eris's hand tightened noticeably. But when I saw how Orsted, Rudy, and you fight, well, I realized something. When Rudy is up against something really dangerous, we're not strong enough to stand in front of him like you did. She was looking Eris straight in her eyes. now. The strength in them was downright intimidating, but she didn't flinch or look away. In fact, she stared right back with all the power she could muster. You trained for years so you could be strong enough to do that. I think it's something you should be really proud of. With that, Sylphie released Eris's hands and smiled at her. That's all I wanted to say, really, other than, I'm glad you're here, Eris. Eris wandered down the hallway in something of a daze. How typical. After all that worrying, she'd ended up with the conclusion that she was fine the way she was. But the more she thought about it, the more that sounded right. Rudius was the magician, and she was the sword woman. It was what she'd had in mind all along, from the day she left him for her training. It seemed natural for both of them to play the roles they were best suited for. But Rudius couldn't handle everything else on top of casting spells. He'd done some growing up and learned a bunch of new things, but that didn't make him superhuman. There were some other things he couldn't deal with on his own, and that was where Sylphie and Roxy could step in to help. Of course, Eris's own train of thought wasn't quite this clear or coherent, but she did find herself feeling happy and relieved. She hadn't screwed it up, after all. Her efforts hadn't been wasted. Just knowing that meant the world to her. Oh! Eris's aimless movements through the house had brought her into a quiet little room, and here she'd found a seated woman who was gazing out a window with a absent-minded expression. Oh, hell yeah. Okay. Eris's aimless movements brought her to Zenith. Yeah, it was Zenith Greyrat. Eris had heard about her situation by now. She knew that a long captivity deep inside a labyrinth had left her mind shattered. But to Eris's surprise, Zenith turned toward her, as if sensing her gaze. The woman's eyes were clearly focused on her. Eris straightened her spine reflexively. Regardless of her condition, this was Rudius's mother. She had to put her best foot forward here. With slow, cautious steps, she walked up to Zenith. Eris definitely needed to say something, but she wasn't sure what it should be. She hesitated for a long moment, longing to fold her arms, but refusing to allow herself to do so. Ugh. Oh, I wish I'd paid more attention to those stupid etiquette lessons. For a moment, she flirted with the idea of leaving the room and coming back once she'd worked out what to say, but Zenith was staring up at her patiently, as if waiting for her to speak. Buckling under the pressure, Zenith finally squeaked out the first thing that came to mind. I'm still quite inexperienced, but I'll do my very best. Best? My very best? Eris frowned irritably at her own mistake, but then she noticed Zenith's expression change as well. She was smiling. Eris had always hated it when people smirked at her mistakes, but this didn't look like a smile of amusement. If anything, it was more like an answer. Zenith hadn't said a word, but for some reason, Eris thought she could hear her voice. Try saying that to Rudy instead. There's no point being all formal around me. Without another word, Eris lowered her head to Zenith, and as she did so, she renewed her promise to herself. I'm going to marry Rudius no matter what.
And there we are. We're done. Okay, give me a second. Okay, the show that I'm supposed to be jumping in on is pushed back to 8:30, so I have 50 minutes. So that gives me more than enough time to exercise and to take Toby out for a walk because he needs one. All right, so let's tally up what we got because that's the end. Let me quickly show off this. This is the armor that he used. And there's Eris with her, that's her new sword, I guess. And there's her old sword. And the sheath. Then we've got Orsted and Nanahoshi with and without the mask. Oldius. And there's Aratofi. And there we go. Yeah, that's basically everything. We have finished Volume 15, guys. We will be starting up Volume 16 next week. Kind of crazy, because I think there's only 18 in total, right? So far? So, let me see. Okay, one second. Okay, there. I scrolled too far. You flicked too hard, damn it! Alright, there we go. I hadn't added 18 to Mushoku Tensei yet. Alright, so there we go. Yeah, we're going to start with 16 next. And that's going to be pretty good. Okay. All right, let's get that tally going. What do we got here? 16 is the light novel original, and there are 18 translated. Okay. Let's see, we got 30 crunches, 30 push-ups, 10 heel touches, 10 seconds of planks, 30 squats, 10 jumping jacks. That's it. Okay. And 1 requested Toby pets. I'm going to mark that as completed because I have definitely done all that. Okay. So, all right. Yeah, dude. Let's go ahead and get those 10 jumping jacks out of the way since we got 10 jumping jacks. Hold on, Toby. I got to do exercises. And let's see. It's 30 squats. Okay. Let me move this aside.